Guten Erev Tisha B'av, everyone, to the extent that that's even an appropriate greeting at this time. Actually saw someone wrote today or the other day that he remembers as a child that the old timers in his shul used to greet each other on Tisha B'av and say Guten Churban. I think that's a few steps further than that. At any rate, we are heading into Erev Tisha B'av right now, and last we left off, we were discussing Tikkun Chatzos. I guess I still owe everyone a Hemshech, a part 2. We'll have to see when we get around to that. But right now, especially with the proximity to Tisha B'av, I thought I would discuss the inyan of Kinos in halacha, a little bit of the history, the background, different angles and dimensions to Amiras HaKinos, especially on Tisha B'av, which I believe is probably an appropriate limud heading into Erev Tisha B'av after Chatzos or on Tisha B'av itself. So, of course, I'm sure there are many who will elaborate on the kinahs themselves. But there's also a lot to discuss, as we say in Yiddish, from the arum. And that seems like an appropriate topic right now, following in the usual format that these shiurim usually follow. But I'd like to begin actually with something that sort of bridges the two topics. An interesting shaila and shuva that were printed in the Sefer or the Shalos Shuvas, Be'er Eshek. It was printed in Venice in the year Tov Lamed Daled, Shnas Geulas, Gimel Aleph Lamed Sof, the year 1674. Not necessarily one of the most famous Sifrei Shalos Shuvas, which I guess is something I'll mention somewhat frequently when citing various Shalos Shuvas that aren't household names. But the Sefer Be'er Eshek, Boinis Ase Karav HaMechaber, Bedivrei Shalos Shuvas, Sovevois Al Koitev HaAvoida V'Yiras Hashem. Interesting lashon, interesting description there. It almost sounds like it's about mamish, like today they print books, Shilos and Shuvas and Avodah Yiras Hashem. But no, then it goes on and says, "You said this la'adnei apoiskim rishonim ba'achronim." Seems to be, as far as I can tell, more or less standard halachic discussions, Shilos and Shuvas. Who's the author? Zo Shmoi, Mailas Hachacham Mashalim, etc. Void Meirenu Arav Reb Shabbetai Beer. Presumably, the reason why the sefer is called Be'er Eshek. Shliach Admas HaKodesh, Bivenetzia, like we said, Shnas Geulas, Olam Leprat Katan. So this is a sefer of Shalos Shuvas printed by Reb Shabbetai Beer, a Shliach from Eretz Yisrael in Venice in the year Tov Lamed Daled. Now let's jump straight into the question first, and then we'll pause and we'll back up and figure out who this author is and what the background is and what the context is at this particular time. But the title of the shaila actually appears in very large, bold letters. Shaila chavtes al hakinos she'omrim be'ashmeiros. So that's why this is sort of a segue in the sense that calls it kinos, but it's she'omrim be'ashmeiros, essentially those that used to say piyutim as well during Tikkun Chatzos in the morning or something along those lines. And Reb Shabbetai writes, Shaltani, you requested that I express my opinion if it's the right thing to do, if it's correct to continue saying the kinahs that are recited while sitting on the earth early in the morning, or perhaps shall we not say them anymore? Why? Kivan, the ha'idna, right now, miknaf ha'aretz, zemira shamaynu mimizrach u'mimayrev va'amru, kiruach Hashem nigla al zkenim asher chaloimus, Yachaloimun ubachurim chezyonos ro v'kula magidim al hageula kikreva lavai. So essentially, we're hearing from all corners of the earth that those who are known to see visions, whether it's the zakenim who see chaloimus and bachurim who see chezyonos, but all are in agreement, all are envisioning or witnessing or seeing visions of the same thing, that the geula is imminent, which is, by the way, an interesting way of putting it. He's not framing it as in terms of the leaders of a movement who are necessarily the ones that are making the statements, making the predictions, leading the movement. describing it more as a grassroots thing that from all corners of the earth, those that are a bit more spiritually inclined, those that see dreams and visions, they're all in agreement. There's this chorus of voices from across the world who are all chattering about the imminent Geula. And then he adds, "V'gam koile koilis nishmu al rivaveis alpha Yisrael asher mechoshech nigalu." And there's already much discussion about tens of thousands of Jews who have already been redeemed. Unclear immediately what he's referring to, but perhaps there were rumors at the time, perhaps about the Aseres HaShvatim making their way from the Harei HaChoshech, so that might be a little reference to that concept. We know that for many hundreds of years, the way most Jews envisioned the Geula unfolding was that there were thousands or tens of thousands or millions of Jews on the other side of the Sambatyon or behind the Harei HaChoshech, different versions, variations of this idea, but there was this notion that there's this large group of Jews who live independently, and they're sort of held in place by Hashem, or they're placed behind some natural barrier, and when the time will come, they will be released, they will be unleashed, and they will lead the entire world Jewry towards redemption. So this may be alluding to that. V'amarta, addressing whoever the questioner is, you said, Ki rabba migdolei ircha u'mehachoyrem v'hachachamim, the gdolim, the leaders, the sages, they're considering it to be true and correct. This is a special time. This is a unique moment. This is the moment when Yidden are being gathered. And it's not the time. It's not appropriate to mourn and cry anymore. Now it's time to be merry and rejoice. And you asked of me to respond with my opinion, even if I'm unworthy. But listen to what I'm going to tell you. You be quiet. You listen. And I'm going to teach you something. So let's pause now, like I said, and let's take a look. What's going on here? So the place to look, like I mentioned last time, is the book Shluchei Eretz Yisrael by Avram Yari. Like I mentioned, there's a chapter, Shluchei Eretz Yisrael, Tnuas Ruchnius B'Yisrael, in which he covers the Aseres HaShvatim angle, that I just mentioned again, and he covers the Shabbetai Beer angle, like we mentioned last time. And indeed, he has this whole chapter, this whole section of a chapter going through different stages and different developments and the involvement of different Shluchei Eretz Yisrael. Well, let's just focus, for the sake of this discussion, on the portion that's directly relevant. So apparently, after describing at length how many Shluchei Eretz Yisrael were perhaps more pro this development, pro the movement, he then begins the preceding paragraph, Ulam lo kol Shluchei Eretz Yisrael pa'alu l'tovat ha'shabtaut. Not all of them were pro. There were some that were acting in the opposite direction. So, for example, Rabbi Yosef Dayan, who was sent on Selichos Eretz Yisrael 5 times to North Africa, to Italy, and to Persia, and was sent on behalf of Chevron to Italy in the year Taf Lamed Gimel, 1673. So, when he was in Italy, he had spoken out against the prophecies of Nasan Ha'azati. Now, 1673 is at a very delicate moment. Shabtai Tzvi is still alive, but he had been compelled by the Sultan to convert to Islam in Taf Chavav, 1666, and he died in 1676. So, 1673 and 1674, which is the period we're talking about, is probably a very delicate and confusing time. Interestingly, parenthetically, as of 1673, Shabtai Tzvi, who had previously been living with some measure of freedom in Turkey and been running whatever show it was that he had going on, blending, I suppose, Islam and Judaism to whatever extent. So he'd actually been rearrested, and he'd actually been exiled to a town in Albania called Ulcin. Ulcin today actually happens to be in Montenegro, but was part of Albania at the time. Just a bit of a random historical footnote. There's a question as to whether Shabtai Tzvi was buried there or whether it's somewhere else in that general area. At any rate, that's where things were holding at the time. So at any rate, Yari points to a letter that was written by someone in Italy at the time who, it's an anti-Sabbatean letter, and the letter references Ha'ish HaMechudaf HaMagudaf, that's Shabbetai Tzvi himself, about how terrible of a person he was, and his whole track record of problematic behavior going back many, many years. Also goes on, refers to Nasim ben Yamin, and asserts that he's been tested many times and all of his predictions have never panned out. Interesting distinction, by the way, I would add, and how this letter goes about advancing its criticism of each individual and focusing on Shabbetai Tzvi's character and personality versus Nasim ben Yamin's predictions or lack of success in that field. And that letter concludes, Va'ata bali ireinu, or that passage concludes, Va'ata bali ireinu achacham hashalem, Reb, and it's missing, it says Rabbi Yosef Dayan, but Yari says it has to be Reb Chia. Rabbi Yosef Dayan, Shliach Chavrin, V'siperli, Ka'ela v'Ka'ela, he had much more to add in this vein. So there you have a Shliach of Chavrin who's apparently going on the record and saying negative things about the movement at the time. And then the next passage in Yari's presentation is that Shabbetai Beer also operated against the Sabbatean excitement. He was on slichos from Yerushalayim in Italy in the year 1674, and that's when, in fact, he printed his Sefer Tshuvas Be'er Eshek, and he was asked Taka this question. Elsewhere in the book, by the way, he elaborates a bit more on Shabbetai Beer's biography. Taka in 1674, Shabbetai Beer had been sent from Yerushalayim. He had actually traveled to Eretz Yisrael. He had originally been from Italy and settled in Yerushalayim, and he had spent 22 years learning Torah in Italy from Rabbi Yitzchak Berechia Fano, who was the son-in-law and grandchild of Ramami Fano. So that was his particular background. It seems that later in the 1800s there was also a Rav in Italy by the name of Shabbetai Beer, so presumably an Italian mishpacha of Chachamim and Rabbanim perhaps. And Taka on the Slichos in Venice in 1674, he printed his Tshuvas Be'er Eshek, and he calls himself, as we mentioned earlier on the Sharblat, Shliach Admas HaKodesh, and Yari is Medayak. Why does it say Shliach Admas HaKodesh, not Shliach Yerushalayim? Seemingly, people were usually sent specifically from either on behalf of Yerushalayim, or on behalf of Tzvas, or on behalf of Chevron. But in this case, uniquely, perhaps, in addition to being sent mainly on behalf of Yerushalayim, he had also taken it upon himself to resolve or deal with some matters relating to Tzvas and Chevron. Yari notes that at the end of the Sefer of Tshuvas, there's a hisnatzlos, an apology that this printing wasn't on the level that I would have wished it to be, and it's because the Mechaber is metapel b'shlichusay, sort of preoccupied with his main reason for being here, is slichos from Eretz Yisrael. He wasn't able to supervise, oversee the malacha and beautify it to the extent that he had intended. But let's get back to the question and answer at hand. Right? So the question had been, is this a time of schoik and rekoid? And Reb Shabbetai Beer responds as follows. He says, Rabu kumei rabu etzli tamei mitzvahs hesped shel evil tzion. I have many reasons. You want from psukim, I have psukim. You want mimasninon, you want mirazi Torah, you want misvara, I have them all. And it's important to emphasize Razi Torah here in the sense that he's going to make the argument, as we shall see, that surely we're still in Galus from many different aspects and dimensions. But Tikkun Chatzos specifically, we know, can only be understood within a Kabbalistic context, as we touched on last time. And specifically regarding the Galus HaShchina, and there are different degrees to how technical one can get if one wants to discuss what Galus HaShchina means Kabbalistically. And we got a bit into it last time in terms of the minhag and yeshivas HaMekubalim and Rav Lefia's shtickle Torah, where he was trying to figure out how there could be any possibility for saying that there's been some change, and how would that stem with technicalities within the Ari's Kabbalah. Now, Reb Shabbetai Beer isn't going to get as technical, but what he's going to say, his arguments here, have to be seen with that in mind, through that lens, that he's also making, or maybe even primarily making, Kabbalistic arguments. It's just sort of subtle, and you have to pay attention to how he's making those arguments, sort of trying to prove from reality that surely the Kabbalistic dimension to reality can't be that different, can't be out of whack with what we are perceiving to be the Metzias right now, right here on the ground. So he begins by making an analogy to the Geula Rishona of Me'eretz Mitzrayim is a siman labanim beGeula Hasida Love ki Meitzeischa Me'eretz Mitzrayim Arenu Neflois. And he says Yetzias Mitzrayim is mentioned 50 times in the Torah. Lirmoy is al Achedos Hagadol k'mei she'omar Ramban. So it's all a remez really for the Geula Hasida. That's why Yetzias Mitzrayim is emphasized to the extent that it is. So he says, if so, let's check the analogy. Let's see at what point in Yetzias Mitzrayim would we have said, oh, the Geula has arrived. So he says, Ein Safek, that until the Tzivos Hashem actually were Yotzei Me'eretz Mitzrayim, even if Moshe is already present, and Moshe is doing unbelievable Eisus and Moifsim B'Seichech Mitzrayim, so he's demonstrating all kinds of wondrous things within Mitzrayim itself. Adayin Hayu B'Soid Golos. So there again you see the mystical dimension. Surely if we had to characterize what is happening spiritually, mystically, surely it would still be correct to say that they are B'Soid Golos until the Layachlu L'Hismameya. To the extent of Layachlu L'Hismameya, how do we interpret that? We say that at that point, if they had stayed another moment, they would have descended into the Shara Chamishim Shel Tumah, which just goes to illustrate as to what is happening spiritually. Spiritually, Moshe is accomplishing all these wondrous things, and yet they are still falling further within Tumah, and they have to leave that moment, or else it's too late. So that tells you what's going on spiritually, mystically, B'Soid Golos. If they hadn't made it out that moment, etc., so if that's the case, Hashtanami, the same is the case right now, that until we can actually point and demonstrate and prove that we're free, how can we switch from Kinos to shiur? We have to continue being Nisainen, Velispoid, Al Tzivos Hashem, Asher B'Eretz Mitzrayim. That's the state we're in. So the analogy is perfect. We are still in Eretz Mitzrayim. Moreover, if we're speaking about Shechina specifically, he says, look at the Yetzias Mitzrayim. Even after they emerged from Mitzrayim, there still was no molin kavua l'Shechina. The Shechina still didn't have a proper dwelling place, a resting place. So if we had to characterize the state of the Shechina was still B'Soid Golos. It was still in exile. Ad asher hukam ha-Mishkan, until they got to the Mishkan. Uchiditnan, ad shlei hukam ha-Mishkan. And he seems to be alluding to the Mishnah in Zochem, ad shlei hukam ha-Mishkan, nahayu ha-Bamis mutares, va'avoida b'vcheiros, misha hukam ha-Mishkan, nesru ha-Bamis, va'avoida b'kayanim. So until the Mishkan was erected, the Shechina wasn't settled. So kol shekein achshav. I mean, what happened now? Where's the Shechina right now? Where's the dwelling place for the Shechina? And then he turns to David. He says, "Shachar of Shiloh we made David." We find that David was fasting and he didn't sleep, he didn't rest till he'll find the proper place for the Mishkan, for the Beis Hamikdash. So if so, Manasa achshav she'ein oil v'loy bias. Right now there's nothing, and look how distressed David was then. So how much more distressed should we be now? And then he goes on to somewhat cryptically make a reference to the state of the Har HaBayis right now, and he quotes part of a passage which is a memra of the Gemara and Chazal and Sanhedrin. Gemara and Sanhedrin, Daf Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph says, "Vayavoyu kol sarim melech Bavel, vayeshu b'shara tovech." That this is in Yirmiyah Perek Lamed Tes, right after it said, "Ba'ashte Esrei Shana l'tzidkiyo, b'chodesh Revi, b'tisha l'chodesh, hafka ha'er." So this is Tes Tammuz, without getting into that whole discussion, but hafka ha'er Tes Tammuz, according to Yirmiyah Perek Lamed Tes. Vayavayu kol sarim melech Bavel, vayeshu b'shara tovech. So they took up quarters at the middle gate. Now, maybe the simple pshat of the words might indicate that it's referring to some location within the Ir, Hafka ha'ir. There's no reference yet to the Har HaBayis. But the Gemara in Sanhedrin seems to understand that Shara Tavech is referring to a location in the Beis HaMikdash. If you look in Rashi there, Rashi says, Hainu Bahar HaBayis Uba Azara. The Gemara says, that's how they darshan shara tovech. She says, Hatavech loshen choitech. That was the place where Sanhedrin would sit in the Azara, the Lishkas Hagazis, and that's where they were mechatech halachas. And now who's sitting there? Now, Vayevayu kol sarei melech Bavel vayeshu b'shara tovech. Rashi says, Makom shei mechatchem by v'dorshin halachas nepach l'meishav leitzim shel sarei melech Bavel. How sad that the Lishkas Hagazis became the meishav leitzim. So then the Gemara adds, Rav Papa said, Hainu da Amri Inshi. So here's where the Gemara, the Gemara will commonly quote sort of what seem to be popular phrases in Aramaic, a phrase that people say. So Hainu da Amri Inshi, Be'asra de More, Tala le Zaine, Tamon, Kulba, Raya, Kulse, Tala. So Rashi, in the place where the master used to hang his kalim, Kol Baraya, novel Raya, the despicable shepherd, Kol Seitala, Kader Tala, he hangs his stuff. How pathetic, how upsetting that the place of the former glory is now used for such lowly things. So that's what the Welcz says, in general, in some other context. And Rav Papa is applying it here to this taich of Shara Tavach, that the Sarei Melech Bavel sat in the Makom Shemechatchen by halachas. That's a statement the Gemara makes about the Churban Bayis Rishon. So that's the phrase, that's the part of the phrase that Shabbetai Beer cites here. He says, V'kol baraya taman kol seitala, alluding to the fact of what's going on in the Har Bayis right now, after the Churban Bayis Sheni and hundreds of years later, what's going on right now. And then he makes another sort of cryptic, you have to decipher what he's saying, but he has this whole sequence, this whole line about ha'arol v'hatame, ha'arol b'arlas basar, v'hatame tame yikra, shemol v'loy para v'tumase olav. That there's something with the tame and the arol and the tame. The arol is someone who's completely uncircumcised. And the tameh is someone who's still tameh because he's partially circumcised. He did the milah, but not the priya, so he's still tameh. Without spelling out what he's trying to say, but very clear that what he's trying to say is, presumably, that right now the Har Bayis is occupied either by Christians, that are Arela Mamish, or by Muslims, tameh, shemol v'lei para, because as we know, the Muslims practice a version of milah, but it's milah without priya. Sagt Reb Shabtai, Mikra Malei Kosov, Al Zeh Haya Doveli Beinu, the Geimer, Al Hart Zion Sheshamim, Shualim Hilchu Boy. So Mkein Ketzad Lei Nispeduna Kainen. So let's talk in concrete concepts. You want to throw ideas around, the Geula is happening spiritually. The spirituality is very much tied to the physical reality. If the Shechina has a Beis HaMikdash to dwell in, so then the Shechina is doing great. If the Shechina doesn't, then the Shechina is in Galus. Let's take a look. How's the Har Bayis doing? There's the Adol, there's the Tameh, Shualim Hilchuvai, Hashtavade Shualim Hilchuvai. Look at the reality. Can't deny the reality. You can't disconnect yourself from that. And here in the following line, he comes perhaps the closest to using Kabbalistic terminology. He says, V'oid, ki ha'eshes chayil, eim habanim smecha, leis la migarmo klum, laseis teref levesa. Which again is using Kabbalistic terminology, referring to Malchus, but anchoring it in the reality. He goes on and says, Shteit in Chazal, mitamtis Bavel, Eretz Yisrael sheisa. Eretz Yisrael is getting its shefa from Bavel. V'oivdei avodah zara b'tara anu, ki tzrichim anu l'spal b'shlei meir v'al tova. Right, so look at the reality. In mamish concrete terms, the Goyim are in charge. We're in Galus. We're getting our shefa through the Goyim, which is one way of expressing the state of Galus. Moving up in geographic terms, Mitamtis Bavel Eretz Yisrael Shoisa, Eretz Yisrael is under the thumb of other nations. Obviously, in this case, not Bavel strictly, you could say the Ottoman Empire, but the idea being that Eretz Yisrael is still very much not its own entity, it's under the control of the nations. So moving up to more spiritual dimensions, and this is all implied, you have to unpack it. So, Zicher Weisto is that's taka, that's indeed what's happening Baruchnius, that however you describe the state of Galus, but the Kedusha seems to be held captive by other forces, and we are receiving from them. So if so, v'lomle nasa mispid, ein lanu chanoya bekarka Eretz Yisrael, v'lei matnas kohuna, v'lei sadus uchramel, hatuma adayin krucha acharenu, ein oichlin chulim betara afilu be'Eretz Yisrael, v'suru tamei karu lanu. So again, this dual argument grounded in reality, but also in spiritual terms. If we don't have a foothold in the karka, and to the extent that we don't have our matnas kohuna and all of that, so doesn't that tell you what you need to know about the state of tumah versus kedusha? And we ourselves are in a state of tumah. We're not being oichel chulim betara. We are tameh. So imkein eich niya mikdash lishkein shchina b'teichenu. So that more or less concludes his second argument. His first argument was compared to where we are in the chronology of Galus to Geula compared to Yetzias Mitzrayim. The second argument is look at the state of the Shechina, look at the presence of the Shechina. Does the Shechina have a presence that's comparable to the Mishkan or comparable to the Beis HaMikdash, or what is the true state of Harabayas, Eretz Yisrael, the Jewish people at large? That was the argument we just concluded. Now he moves on to his third argument. Zois v'oid, next argument. What are the three things Yidden are commanded when they enter Eretz Yisrael? Lahamid la'melech, lahachre zari shalamalek, v'livnis lam beis abchira. Three things. Those are the three things you do when you enter Eretz Yisrael, and when the Geula will arrive, we're going to enter Eretz Yisrael. This is what we're going to do. V'adayin ein shem echad mehem. How many things have we checked off the list so far? 0. And here he again seems to make a subtle implied argument about the state of whether or not there is currently an individual who is Mashiach. And this is how he says it. V'afilu davar melech Yisrael, af al pi shenimshach, b'mei shol, lo yahya melech, v'lo yahya tiva yotzei, v'lo yarotzis v'lo amim ovdim oisai, v'ein melech b'lei am. And I think this, once again, is a perhaps very clever and very subtle argument, in which, if you pay attention, he never really goes out and contests whether the Geula is coming or whether the individual who's Mashiach has already arrived. He's not going there. That's not where he wants to contest this. That's not where he wants to wage his battle. So what's he saying? He's saying, David Melech Yisrael. We all believe David was Taka Melech Yisrael, and he, in a certain sense, perhaps himself, you can describe him as Mashiach. At any rate, he was Nimshach, physically with Shaman HaMishcha. So David Melech Yisrael, even after he was Nimshach, so he was already David, he was there, he was alive, he had been selected for his mission, he had been Nimshach, but as long as it was Bimei Shaul, David could still not be described as a king, and there was nothing about him that was an indication of his leadership taking off, spreading, and there were no nations and no land subservient to him. Ve'ein melech b'lei am. So then what makes you a king? If there's no, if you have no following, if your kingship doesn't express itself in any concrete way, then you can't seriously argue that you are a melech. And he leaves that point at that. But like I said, this is, you could say, a fairly clever and subtle argument. And now what's he saying? He's saying, David, uncontested. No one's challenging David's stature and his rule, and he was Nimshach. But you still have to follow the Metzias. Even if you know for a fact, you have clear vision, you see David, and you know that he's Nimshach. You have to look around and acknowledge the reality. Is he a Melech right now, or is he not a Melech right now? If he doesn't have the indicators that would suggest that he's conducting his Melucha in any sense, a Melech Blayam, he's not a Melech right now. And clearly he's trying to allow you to draw your own conclusions about the implications and the applications for the present day and age. Which, circling back to how he launched this argument with the Lahamid Lamelech, Lahachre Zay Shalamalek, etc., Lahamid Lamelech is not being mentioned here innocently. It's being mentioned very deliberately as a key argument that, were we really Lahamid Lamelech? Yeah, were we Mekayim that? No, we haven't. And then he goes on to seemingly marshal this argument to sort of reinforce his previous point, which is Tumah versus Tara of Yerushalayim. That Mekadesh Yerushalayim, what is required? It's a Mishnah. You need Efer Chatos, Melech, Nasi, Kohen Gadol, Urim V'Tumim, Shivim Sanhedrin, Shtei Toides, B'chol Yisrael, Mishnah and Makkos. And here we don't have a single one, including underscoring a Melech. So getting back to his Golos Hashchina argument, so Heichen Huim Kein Ashras Hashchina Shalei Tehei Goyla Shalei Nitztarech Lis Oinen V'Lifkos. So you're going to tell me there's no Golos Hashchina? Where's the Shchina right now? The Shchina can't be in Yerushalayim, so it's in Golos. If it's in Golos, then we still need to be Misoinen and to get to cry. Then he says, "V'embanu lodun al pi midrashe Rabbeinu." Maybe that's an implied barb that those making other arguments tend to find their best sources from midrashim. He says, "You want to talk midrashim? What does it say? Amru nishba kadosh baruch hu shelo yikanis bebeis hamikdash shel mayla ad sheyivna sheyibana beis hamikdash shel mata." At this point, I guess you could say that Maimer Chazal is a little bit more well known due to the Avram Fried song Loi Avoy, Yerushalayim Shalmayla, the Gemara in Tainus. So there you go, right there on the record. It's talking about the Eibishter, whether Hashem has a dwelling place, has a rest. From Kain Shein Loi Lamayla Menucha, like they say. So Ketzad Loi Nispait. So we have to remain in a state of sadness, of crying. Then he gives an interesting interpretation. He says, "V'kadoim ali," I think that's Chazal's kavana when they say, "Hishpia Kadosh Baruch Hu es Yisrael shlo yidchaku es haketz shenamar ishbat yaschem im teiru v'im teiru es ha'ava ad shetachbatz." And of course, the whole concept of being deichik es haketz is a very touchy, controversial inyan. But the way he seems to be teaching it is that what's teiru v'im teiru es ha'ava, the hainu psuke ava. He seems to be saying that don't shift gears. Don't start acting like the Gul already came and change your tone to Psuke Ava when that's not the case, when that hasn't happened yet. You have to be aware of the Mitzias. You have to be aware of the reality. Where are we holding right now? It's still before the Ketz. So up until it's time to reflect the new reality, we have to remain with the old reality. We still have to cry. Here he quotes the Gemara, when do we get to laugh? When do we get to rejoice? When it happens. So again, you just have to be anchored to the reality. Is it Higdal Hashem Lasas? It's not. So then it's not Ozim Al Yischek Pinu. And here once again he alludes to his dual argument, and he says, "V'em ein loy lamayla v'loy lamata, loy achdusa v'loy reusa v'loy chedvasa kidakayos," using Zoharic terminology that if things change spiritually, then those are terms you might use. Achdusa, reusa, chedvasa. But that's not the case right now. Certainly not lamata, and if so, not lamayla as well. So lo malay nasa mispid. So we have to keep doing what we're doing. And here's where he gets to the psukim. He had alluded to the fact that he has psukim to make his case. A number of psukim that describe this oiri meyafer kumi. So if and when that happens, that's one thing. Until it happens, it's not the situation we're in. V'tuyi Hashem yeshuvon v'nas yagen v'anacha. When they return, then v'nas yagen v'anacha. Otherwise, there is yagen v'anacha, etc. And a few psukim in this vein. I'm not going to do each one. Then he quotes the pasuk v'chi yavayu ki b'schus habechi yavayu. It's a pasuk in Yirmiyah, Perek Lamed Aleph, "V'chi yavayu v'sachanunim oivileim oilichem el nachale mayim." So he's saying, "V'chi yavayu," like he said, "B'schus habchi," that's the schos that will bring us. And what's the hiluch el nachale mayim? He says it's a remes to tara and to tshuva. And here all of a sudden he interjects and he says, "By the way, check out the Rambam at the end of Hilchos Malachim," which today is probably a pretty famous passage. "Hamelach sheyakov es Yisrael lishmer teira shebiksav v'shabal peh v'sheyasef oisam Yerushalayim v'yivna beis hamikdash v'yatzliach harei zeh melech hamashiach v'anu leireinu adayin shum echad mehem." Again, I'm not sure how it fits in with the structure of the argument he's making, which he wants to make return to in a moment about Shuvah. But it's interesting how he once again interjects and takes a more direct shot at the whole concept of Mashiach and there being a Melech, HaMashiach presently. Look at the Rambam. The Rambam says what the Melech HaMashiach's job is and what the course of events, the order of events is supposed to be. And if you haven't seen that, so we're not there. So so back to the Kabbalistic argument, the Shechina is surely still in Galus. But back to the B'vchi Avoyu B'schus Abchi, so here he makes an interesting point. He says, V'ilu lahaya hamisbed vanehi ela mishum tshuva afilu im nis'eder ha'gu'ula kama tzrichem anu lis'eder b'tshuva. Says, you know what? Let's say you want to say it's more complex. The Geula has been awakened. There are spiritual processes that are taking place right now. Things aren't quite the same with the Galus HaShechina. Let's just say that the crying is an act of tshuva. So if the Geula is here, how much more so do we need tshuva right now? This is the time for tshuva if the Geula is on the verge, is about to arrive. Of course, the pasuk says, "V'shuva v'nachas tivashe," and shuva being tshuva, uvoletzi and goyel l'shavei fesha. So the Geula comes l'shavei fesha when you repent from sin. U'betanoi at tshuva, one of the conditions of tshuva, hiya b'chi. And here it says v'hafsed, but it's probably a typo, and it should say v'hesped. And we did mention already that he acknowledged that the sefer wasn't printed perfectly. So abchi v'hesped, surely. And here he quotes the Baal Reishis Chachma, who taught a very particular Kabbalistically infused derech hatshuva, kitzarach adam l'dmoya. You have to cry, you have to shed tears. Lahaver admoya islam mitzchein, and then we have to take the tears and wipe it on our forehead. Lahaver reisham ha'aveinus, to remove the mark of the Avinus. We know that Arizal used to identify the mark of the Avinus on the people who visited him. The pasuk says, "Rachatz Hashem tzayas b'nei tzion." You need to remove the tzaya, and you have the pasuk Yeshiv Badad v'Yidaim, and that also refers to tshuva. And there's a netrikun from the word tshuva. Tshuva is Rosh Tevis, Tainus, Sak, Ve'efer, Bechi, Hesped. So that's how tshuva looks. That's what tshuva is. All of those elements which are also associated with mourning are also elements of tshuva. So his argument is, you want to tell me that the Galus HaShechina thing is Nishtana Zeh Pashat, so put that aside. Do we still have to do tshuva? Now is Ershta time to be doing tshuva, and tshuva contains those identical elements of Taina Sak Ve'efer B'chi Hesped. So you keep at it, you keep doing the tshuva until the process of Geula is completed. And it's interesting to point out that this perhaps ties in a bit to what was discussed previously, but how the Alter Rebbe seems to take Tiknei Chatzos and personalize it a lot more, sort of shift it away from focusing so much on Galus HaShechina in the cosmic sense, and referring more to the Galus HaShechina in the personal sense, and one's own Chatam and Avinus, and one's own tshuva, that it's a tshuva event. So it's just interesting to point out the parallel, not necessarily that the Alter Rebbe was saying this on the basis of some argument about changes with the Galus HaShechina. Adrabah, the Alter Rebbe frames it as, this is your personal Galus HaShechina. Whereas Bereshek is going further and saying, you want to put aside the Galus HaShechina, but you still have to work on yourself. Your issues are not resolved. And he adds, that's its own whole dimension. We need a daven about Chavli Mashiach. So, so for that alone, either just to cry about our Avedis, or to do it as a tefillah, you're davening. Surely there's absolutely still 100% a place to be reciting those kinahs in the early morning hours. Shaita derachme, bekadmosa de tzafra, oy balgusa de lelia, taka either in the early hours of the morning or at chatzos, whatever the different minhagim were. And he adds, Movad kama taima diksivu, I guess alluding back to all his previous arguments, which were that, in his opinion, of course there's still Galus HaShechina, but if you want to put that aside, that's in addition to my previous arguments about the Galus HaShechina. If you don't say them, Zaris v'nifsed karina, I'll call them Zaris v'nifsed, because on the one hand, Zaris, these people are still very from and Greis Chsidim, Lefi, their what Chsidus was at that time, to get up early, so they're still inspired and they're trying to do the right thing, and then they're v'nifsed, because the Matzah Takuni Ela V'Tatu, they could be doing Tikkunim right now, Tikkun Chatzos, and they're not doing Tikkunim. So, Zad is v'nifsad. And so here it concludes, here's the end, that you have to dedicate yourself to this Evel, Achatus Eider, Avas Chesed La'ela, V'yakim Sukos Dovid Hanefeles, V'binyan Abayas V'ha'ariel, Uvolitzi and Goyel, Ushavei Fesha, Yihiratzin, Sheniske V'nichya, V'nira, B'meheda B'yameinu, Amen. That's how he concludes. So again, using perhaps some Kabbalistic terminology, Shatus Eider, Avas Chesed La'ela, and again, it should express itself realistically in binyan abayas, and in that case, as we like to conclude, Uvolitzi and Goyel, Ushavei Fesha, but also alluding back to what he mentioned in that context about doing tshuva, and Yiratzin Taka, that we should live to see it. And with that, he concludes, and we conclude this very fascinating shaila and tshuva. And like I said, if you pay attention the way I hope we did, you can see how very specific and clever and pointed and targeted his tinus are. He's being very, very careful and targeting his tinus to the audience, to what he believed the audience needed to hear. And perhaps we should mention that just like Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Hillel, as we quoted last time, draws the parallel between what Rav Abulafia was discussing in the Yeshivas and Mekubalim about Tikkun Chatzos and changes to the Galus HaShechina, and Rav Hillel says part of the benefit in bringing this back up again and dredging this up is to draw the parallel to similar phenomena today, in which there are people who argue that things have changed. Here, in this case, some things have indeed changed in Eretz Yisrael, for example, from the Zionist argument. So we know Tisha B'av as well. Some have made the argument that how can you say Nachem, Ir, Ha'avela, etc. Although obviously, if you look at Shabbetai Beer's tinus here, most of them are still applicable even in today's situation. Most of the things he says are absent, or the problems that are still present, most of it is still applicable. You could say there's a bit more chanoya bekarka, I guess, the chadoime, but most of what he said still stands. So just like Rav Hillel made the point with Rabbi Abulafia, that we can make the parallel, we can draw the parallel, make the analogy to similar arguments today. So perhaps in this case as well, with Shut Be'er Eshek, that we can also draw the parallel to various arguments that are presented, that are pushed about how perhaps either the Metzias today has changed, or the Ruchnias today has changed. And we see that already so many years ago, almost 350 years ago, for Hayel Eilamim, they had the same argument, they had the same questions, and Rav Be'er made these powerful arguments. Well, so that, as usual, went on for longer than I had anticipated, but I think it was well worth the time, and it's a nice meditation to consider heading into Tisha B'av about the state that we are in right now, and to provide some perspective both from looking around at the reality today and some historical perspective for a parallel in time where people were conducting similar discussions. And this is all in the spirit of heading into preparing for Tisha B'av. But now let's move on to discussing actual kinus of Tisha B'av. And there were a number of things that I had in mind that I wanted to cover and discuss here. One is some basic facts and information about the origins of Kinos on Tisha B'av and what they are and how they work. Additionally, an interesting discussion about how there was an old minhag, an old forgotten Sephardic minhag of saying Kinos or piyutim along the lines of Kinos on the Shabbosim that precede Tisha B'av, the Tlasot de Paranusa. There was an interesting minhag of saying Kinos on those Shabbosim as part of the Tefillah, similar to, I guess you could say, the Dal Parshias, Shabbosim like that, as well as an interesting discussion a few hundred years ago about piyutim that were in the Sephardi kovtzim of Kinos, right? I'm assuming, at least from my Ashkenazi-centric perspective, that most of the audience is Ashkenazi, so we're familiar with the kovtzim of Ashkenazi Kinos for Tisha B'av, but Sephardim had a different kovtzim, and up until not that long ago, they contained very interesting kinahs that also related to Girish Sfarad, just as the Ashkenazi kinahs include kinahs for different tragedies that took place in Ashkenaz. So the Sephardim had kinahs that referred to Gerish Svarad, and an interesting objection to reciting some of those kinahs a few hundred years ago. As well as, I want to conclude, let's see how much time this is going to take, I want to conclude with discussing the very fascinating minhag of mischief and mayhem and shol during reciting Avecha, reciting kinahs, which is a real minhag. And I would say it's perhaps a bit more known in Chabad, mostly forgotten elsewhere, but the history of this minhag is actually very interesting and surprising, especially if you assume that it's mainly a Chabad thing. Well, let's start first, like I said, with the origin of kinahs and how the Seder of davening and kinahs came to be the way it is today. So for that we have to turn, the obvious source we would turn to is the Kinos by Goldschmidt. Seder HaKinos Tisha B'av Keminhag Poilin uKehilas Ashkenazim Eretz Yisrael Mugo Umavur B'idei Daniel Bar Avraham Shlomo Goldschmidt Heitzas Moshe Rav Kook, printed a number of times by Moshe Rav Kook. It's obviously meant to serve somewhere in between a scholarly work, a scholarly treatment of the piyutim, but also can serve as an actual Seder Kinos for those that want to say the Kinos and Tisha B'av from a more sophisticated, advanced, scholarly edition of the Kinos. As has been pointed out many times by many, the Rebbe, in fact, used the Seder HaKinos by Daniel Goldschmidt, Moshe Rav Kook, on Tisha B'av, even though the Rebbe mentioned the minhag of buying disposable Kinos and leaving them behind and shul and buying a new one each year to demonstrate one's emunah and the imminent arrival of the Geula. But Lamaisa, the Rebbe used Dafka, the Seder HaKinos of Daniel Goldschmidt, which is interesting on a number of levels, not least that the text of the Kinos is corrected and improved compared to the standard Kinos that one might find in the standard prints that have evolved from back in Europe, back from the Eastern European printing presses. And the truth is really that there's a larger issue with all piyutim, including all the slichos, in which there are probably a lot of corrections that need to be made. And when it comes to stam slichos for other days of the year, the piyutim, as the slichos as they're printed in the siddur, have not undergone that layer of academic correction. And it's just interesting that when it came to kinahs, the Rebbe ultimately ended up using dafka such an edition. At any rate, in the context of this discussion, it's not the corrected piyutim, the edition of the piyutim that I'm after. It's the Mavai by Daniel Goldschmidt, who was this great scholar of piyut, and he printed Seder HaKinos, and he printed Seder Slichos and Machzorim, Keminhag Ashkenazim, Keminhag Poilin. Of course, for those familiar with minhag Chabad, for slichos and kinahs and piyutim, it all has to be understood within the context of minhag Ashkenaz and minhag Poilin, and the fork that took place within the many different kehillas that existed a few hundred years ago, and the variations that there were in reciting slichos and piyutim and kinahs. And Chabad situates itself geographically and historically within a certain path within that fork of minhagim, and you have to understand that background in order to understand where the what you would call the quote unquote the nusach Chabad. When it comes to kinahs, as it happens, up until recently there wasn't even a Chabad edition. Now I think there already is, or there might be. Certainly when it comes to slichos and piyutim, there are machzori Chabad, slichos Chabad, but it all really has to be understood within the context of minhag Ashkenaz and specifically minhag Poilin. Sometimes there's even a distinction between minhag Poilin and minhag Liter, Eisen, and Zamet, which comes up in the context of the slichos for Elul, that there's an additional fork between those two. So when it comes to Seder Slichos, I believe that Goldschmidt printed Keminhag Poilin and Keminhag Liter separately, even though they overlap and are pretty similar. So just pointing out that important information if you're coming from that perspective, or from any perspective, just to understand that there's a map of minhagim when it comes to saying slichos and piyutim and kinahs. So I would like to get to his mavai. He has this scholarly mavai sort of summarizing how the Seder of Tisha B'av came to be what it is. He himself seems to be relying on previous scholarship, perhaps summarizing it. He manages to cram the following information into about 2 pages or so. So he points out that before piyutim and kinus were invented, there probably wasn't that much of a difference between the tefillah on Tisha B'av and the tefillah of a regular weekday. The earliest change, presumably, was what we know today as nachem. He's mitzayin to Yerushalmi and Tainas, Rav Acha bar Yitzchok b'shem Reb Chuna Riba de Tzipayden said, Yachid b'Tisha B'av tzarech lahasker me'ena ma'oiro mahu omer Rachem Hashem aleikinu b'rachamecha rabim v'chasedecha ha'ne'emonim aleinu v'al Yisrael amecha v'al Yishalayim yirecha v'al tzinu mishkan kavedecha v'al ha'ir ha'avela ha'harusa ha'shemema ha'nasuna b'yad zorem ha'ramusa b'kaf haritzim, etc. You can see the unique nusach that's preserved in the Yerushalmi. And this nusach, of course, is taking the bracha of Beinu Yerushalayim, which is the theme that's closest to the occasion, taking that bracha and expanding it to refer to the occasion. The next stop in our journey is Masechah Seifrim. Masechah Seifrim is from a later period, some intermediate period, where it describes additional minhagim of reading psukim from Yirmiyahu and from Tehillim and reciting Megillas Eicha. So that's the first time it's mentioned. And it also mentions Targum, that they were Matargum, it goes back then, Kriya, etc., Haftarah. Targum was a big part of the act of reading from Torah, from Nevi'im, etc. It also mentions other minhagim, Avelos, or of skipping parts of davening. Writes it all very bekitzer. By the way, in addition to Seder Kinos of Goldschmidt, so a few years ago, Oiz V'Hadar, which I guess you could say is in a similar or related or parallel line of business, released their own edition of Kinos, called the Kinos Tisha B'av HaMavur Mesifta, using the Mesifta branding. And they too have a mavai. Haven't checked really what work, if any, they've done with the actual text of the Kinos and what the level and standard of their Beer, HaMavur to the Kinos is. But as it happens, they also have a mavai at the beginning of their volume as well. And the first section of their mavai, you could see, is patterned very clearly after the first section of Goldschmidt's mavai. And in a sense, it's an expansion and elaboration with more Ma'ir Mekaymis to Rishayim and Achreinim as well. The quotes from Masechah Seifrim are cited in full, and much more along this vein. So for someone who's interested in reading more on the topic, so in addition to Goldschmidt's Mavai, you can also take a look at Oiz V'Hadar's Mavai. To their credit, at the end of that section, footnote 44, they do write Ayin Kol Zeh Ba'akdamas Seder HaKinos L'Tisha B'av Goldschmidt, so they do acknowledge the origin, but you could see how it tracks pretty closely with Goldschmidt. So that's Masechah Seifrim, which I believe is understood to be referring to minhag Eretz Yisrael at whatever particular point in time. Moving over to Bavel, the minhag of reading Eicha at night was also the minhag of Go'enei Bavel and the 2 yeshivas, and it's mentioned in Seder of Amram Goyen, although he points out that interestingly it's not mentioned in Seder of Saja Goyen. And he then goes on to note, and before I say what he notes, I'll point out that right before as I was preparing to record this, I saw a discussion somewhere where someone asked, wait a second, what's with slichos on Tisha B'av? That's an interesting question, because if you think about it, all other tanaisim, tiniyos, the minhag is to say slichos, and on Tisha B'av the minhag is to say kinus. So in a sense, you might think, okay, it's more or less roughly the same thing. You're saying special piyutim for the occasion. But it's not quite the same thing if you think about it. And I think in the Oiz V'Hadar they flesh it out a bit more. Slichos is patterned around Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim. You sort of intermittently you say Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim, then you say Piyut, Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim, Piyut. Whereas Kinos is not structured that way. There's also the fact of when you say Slichos, so that itself, speaking for Chabad in particular, we're somewhat aware that Slichos do have 2 places where they go, 2 places where they belong. So during Elul, it's pretty much a given that it's said either middle of the night or early in the morning before davening. But when it comes to the Slichos of the tiniyos, so then there's the possibility of saying it before davening, or the possibility of saying it after Shemoneh Esrei, sort of integrated with the Vidui and the Yud Gimel Midas after Shemoneh Esrei. And the minhag Ashkenaz, as we'll get to for Kinos, is that it's not actually said immediately after Shemoneh Esrei, it's said after Kriyas HaTorah. So there are similarities but differences between slichos and Kinos. And so someone was asking, hey, wait a second, essentially we're not saying slichos, we're saying Kinos, it's not the same thing. Why don't we say slichos? So in response to that, this history, this background definitely sheds a lot of light, gives more perspective and dimension to what exactly is going on here. So Goldschmidt says that Rav Amram and Rav Saadia Gaon both mention that the Shatz, who leads the davening for Shachris, says slichos. Now, where are the slichos said? So here's where you also have to understand the history, even of where slichos have come from and the journey it's taken. So back then, slichos were said in the bracha of Chanon Hamarbe L'Sloach. Right? So just as everyone is familiar with the idea that, at least on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, at the very least within Chabad, where we still integrate some piyutim. So where are the piyutim integrated? They're integrated in the first brachas of Chazaras HaShatz of Shemoneh Esrei. The first three brachas, Magen Avraham, Chayim Esim, and Okel HaKadosh, Melech HaKadosh during Yom Neroim. Those outside Chabad would be familiar with the Shabbos for the Daled Parashis as well. They may also be familiar with adding piyutim to Birchas Kriya Shema as well, which is not directly relevant, but just to point out the general structure and how piyutim work. So we know that piyutim, or as they're called yotzris, although yotzris is really alluding to Birchas Kriya Shema, but at some point really all the piyutim of Shabbos and Yom Tovim and Yom Neroim are sort of all commonly known as yotzris. So the yotzris, as we know, are situated within the brachas of Shemoneh Esrei, and perhaps also, if that's your minhag, within the brachas of Kriya Shema, but focusing on Shemoneh Esrei. So that much we know. What's interesting, what you might not know, is that slichos and Kinos, really, both of them, as we'll see, also originated as something that was situated within the brachas of Shemoneh Esrei. But here we're dealing with Yemei Choil, so you have more brachas of Shemoneh Esrei to work with. So the slichos were in the bracha of Chanan Hamarbe L'Sloach, and presumably there were also piyutim or passages that were said in the brachas leading up to, building up to Chanan Hamarbe L'Sloach. But then when you got to Chanan Hamarbe L'Sloach, so that's where the Seder Slichos was recited. So you have to understand that first of all. And that being the case on Stamatainis, the minhag was on Tisha B'av as well, that they said slichos taka in Birchas Chanan Hamarbe L'Sloach and Shemoneh Esrei, just like any other tainis. So this, in essence, is not really our minhag. It's not, slichos and Kinos are not the same thing. So their minhag, essentially, was not our minhag of saying Kinos, but a different minhag, more akin to every other tainis, of saying slichos dafka, which is of a different nature and a different tone, and essentially you could say that the tone of slichos is more along the lines of tachanunim, tefillah, tshuva. In fact, most slichos have nothing to do with tzoymis and tainias at all. It's just about tshuva and pleading with Hashem. And as it happens, when it's a Yom Tzoim, so we're also maskir from Ein HaYoim, so we mention about the tzaros of that day, but it's all just fitting into the framework of Tachanunim L'fnei HaMakim. Whereas Kinos are indeed of a different nature really entirely, and Kinos are more dreary and are focusing on the misery and on the sadness and on the destruction. There might also be a few elements of some prayerful notes and reaching out to Hashem, but the structure, the emphasis truly is fundamentally different than that of slichos. And as we're saying, the concept of Kinos apparently did not exist in Bavel, and instead, the concept of slichos did exist, so the general idea of incorporating piyutim into davening in this fashion existed in both places, but in Bavel, for Tisha B'av, there was slichos exclusively, whereas, as we'll get to Eretz Yisrael in a moment, so that's Reb Amram Gaon or Reb Saadia Gaon. And he adds in a footnote that in the Siddur Reb Saadia Gaon, there's a nusach of 11 slichos for Tisha B'av that ain't safek, undoubtedly he was mechaber himself. And he adds that there are simonim that this must have also have been the minhag in Sfarad, at least for a time, under the influence of Seder of Amram Goin. Because as we know, generally, the general rule, although it might be more nuanced and complex, but generally it's said that Sfarad is more directly in line with Bavel, and Ashkenaz, as we'll see, is more in line with Eretz Yisrael. What's his proof about the minhag in Sfarad? Because he says if you look in the Machzor Sfardim, there's a kreva. Kreva is the term for the structure of piyut that's integrated throughout the brachas. So the first bracha, the second bracha, the third bracha. So like I said, the minhag on Yom Neroim is that the kreva goes until Akel HaKadosh, so that's called the Kedushta. I believe in the Ezra Hadar they elaborate more on this and make it clearer to the reader. So that, so if you want to refer to the entire unit of piyutim that's integrated into Shemana Esrei, you can call it a kreva or krevis, because when one was written originally by one author, so it probably wasn't as long and as many, and that was that individual author's kreva, and then others, or that same author may have written multiple krevis, and other authors wrote krevis, and then the machzor as we have it might be combining and integrating multiple elements from multiple krevis. But at the source, at the origin, there were those who were mechaber a kreva, which, like I said, is probably a lot shorter than the combined version that we see in our machzor. So that's that structure that's integrated, you write, and it's meant to be one lengthy, it's like a hemshech, so you add a few lines into the first bracha, you add a few lines into the second bracha, you add a few lines into the third bracha, you stop there, or you go on. So in the Machzor Sfardim, there's a kreva for Tisha B'av by Shlomo ben Yehuda, and you can see that as with other early krevis for tiniest that were following the old structure of being integrated into Shemana Esrei, it goes until the fifth bracha of the Amidah of Yom Choil, and it stops there. So that's a raya that if it stops at the fifth, that means that in the sixth, that's when they started with slichos. So up until the slichos, there's a kreva, and then when you get to the slichos, that's its own thing, and that's in the sixth bracha of Slach Lanu. Of course, that wasn't the minhag in Sfarad for long, so it must have been bottled at some point. Although, as they point out, the minhag of reading the Megillah of Echa at night became the minhag universally everywhere. Whereas that had not been the minhag as documented in Masechah Seifrim. Masechah Seifrim at night, they said some psukim from Yirmiyahu and Tehillim, and Echa may have been by day. So at any rate, that's all the parallel minhag of saying slichos and Chanan Amar B'Lisloyach. That was the minhag in Bavel, and perhaps for a time, long time ago in Svarad. But what about the minhag that we're familiar with, the kinos? Where do they come from? So as we've already alluded to, kinos were also originally an element that was integrated within Shemona Esrei. And the minhag began in Eretz Yisrael, and presumably even the minhag of slichos of Bavel also originated in Eretz Yisrael. So at the very beginning of this phenomenon, so somewhere after the Zman HaMeiroim, according to the accepted academic understanding and dating of Rabbi Elazar Kallir, without getting into all of that, but as you mentioned, Rabbi Elazar Kallir, they date to the 7th century, the 600s. So that was essentially when this whole concept of piyut being added to tefillah originated, and as we said, it was within Shemona Esrei. So they're mechaber krevis, which we already explained and defined. They were mechaber krevis for all the tiniest, and kreva actually tracked with the entire Shemona Esrei. You added the hisafa to each bracha in the Shemona Esrei, and we still have such krevis have still been preserved in the machzor of Rome, Italy, and the machzor of minhag Romania, where they still preserve this ancient Eretz Yisrael format of a kreva that goes throughout the entire Shemona Esrei, and this was the case for all of the fast days, including Tisha B'av. But in Eretz Yisrael, there was this distinction that for other tiniest, it was slichos in the 6th bracha, but on Tisha B'av, the minhag in Eretz Yisrael was to expand in the 14th bracha of Burning Yerushalayim, just like the Yerushalmi, just like the concept of saying Rachem or Nachem. So once the layer of piyutim was added, that too for Tisha B'av was added dafka to the 14th bracha to Burning Yerushalayim, and that's where the concept of kinos was introduced. The piyutim that were added to that bracha in distinction from the slichos and the sixth bracha and a regular tainus, those piyutim were kinah. And as far as we know, this began with Elazar Kallir, like he said, in the 7th century. And essentially, when you open an Ashkenazi kinah and you see and you pay attention a little bit, you notice that there are kinah from the Kallir. All of those kinah from the Kallir are originally part of the kinah that he composed for the 14th bracha within the larger framework of the kreva for Shemona Esrei. So that is how kinah start. Kinah start in this particular context, in this particular format, for Shemona Esrei, for the 14th bracha ben Yerushalayim. Now, like I said, there's a difference between how these things originate, which might be a lot shorter, and how things have come about and reached us, which might be combining many different elements and pieces from many different individual krevas. So, as Goldschmidt goes on to explain, Elazar Kallir composed 5 separate krevas for Tisha B'av, and you don't say all 5, you choose one of the 5. But this is something Elazar Kallir would do. He would compose multiple alternate krevas for different occasions, and we know that he did 5 for Tisha B'av, one of which is preserved, as we said, in the Machzorim of Rome and Romania. In addition to the kreva, which is shorter, he also composed 50 kinah. There are 50 kinah that we can track, we can identify as having originated from him, all the way back at the beginning when it all started. Of course, Goldschmidt says, originally the kinah would have been part of the kreva. You have the shorter parts, the krevas, for the other parts of the davening, and then you get to Beit Yerushalayim, and then you are saying a number of kinah. But he emphasizes, it's clear that he composed multiple krevas, which means, presumably, like we said, that you're supposed to be choosing one of those krevas, and a portion of the kinah that are attached to each kreva, you weren't necessarily supposed to be saying all of them. And the fact that there are 50 kinah suggests that you probably weren't supposed to be saying all 50 kinah in the middle of the brach of Shemona Esrei. But maybe if there are 5 krevas and the 50 kinah, so let's round it up or down and say that there were 10 kinah to a kreva. So you were supposed to say a kreva, a few lines per bracha, and then say, let's say 10 kinah in perhaps 10 kinah in the bracha ben Yerushalayim. Now Goldschmidt here alludes to the fact that if you really want to understand the structure of the kinah as they appear in the minhag of Ashkenaz, there are elements, there are parts of it that you really can't understand unless you understand the origin within the kreva. And he's meramez to Shavas Suru, the first kinah that we say by day is Shavas Suru, and you'll only really understand it if you understand that it's part of the kreva Zichar Echa. But he doesn't really elaborate. To their credit, they elaborate a lot more and they explain this, and I'm going to take another minute or two to explain why, because it's just a very nice illustrative example as to how understanding this background can actually shape your understanding, Pashat Pshat, of what is happening in the kovtzim of Kinos before us. So if you look at Kinah Vav, which is the first one for the morning, for Shachris, so you'll notice that this Kinah by Elazar Kallir has 6 lines per bias. So if you look at the first one, so it begins with the word Shavas, and then you have 6 lines that each begin with a Samech. Suru meni shemuni oichroi, schiu moes hasimuni be'edrei chaveiroi, sakoisa mishkon mischos deviroi, sakoisa v'havlugu giboiroi, sofku chafu moadu evaroi, ke sila cholabiroi. So those are 6 Samachs. What's going on? What's the structure here? So it's very elaborate in the sense that it's all based on the prakim of Eicha. So the word Shavas is from Pasuk Tezvav of Parak Hey. Parak Hey is the only parak of Eicha that doesn't follow the order of the Aleph Beis. The other prakim of Eicha, of course, are structured around the Aleph Beis, and Rabbi Kallir's piyutim, of course, are structured around the Aleph Beis and other similar devices. So the first word Shavas comes from the 15th pasuk in Parak Hey. Then the rest of the line Suru, the first word of the rest of the line Suru, is from the 15th pasuk of Eicha Parak Daled, Suru Tame Karu Lamai. So he takes the word Suru, and then here finally is where he adds his own words, Meni Shimuni Oichroi. Of course, everything has to rhyme as well. So this bias, it's Oichroi, Chaveiroi, Deviroi. So that's where suru comes from. Then the next three lines begin with sechi, sakoisa, and sakoisa. So those come from the three samachs from Perek Gimel, which has 3 for each letter of the Aleph Beis. Then the next line, safku, comes from the samach of Perek Beis. And then sila, sila, chalabiroi, comes from the word for samach, the pasuk beginning with samach in Perek Aleph. And then the same goes in the next passage. Nafla is from the next pasuk in Perek Hey, not alphabetical. Then you have a bunch of ayins. Eideinu b'tzul dechuya, eini chiksul achazem ben berechya. Everything ends with ya. So Eideinu is the ayin from Perek Dalet. And then eini, ad, and eini are the ayins from Perek Gimel. And then asa is from the ayin of Perek Beis. And then v'nom al ela ani bechia. So of course al ela is from Perek Aleph. And so on and so forth in this vein, samach, ayin, pei, etc. But the question is, for those that are attuned to the structure of the piyutim and the kinus, and you appreciate what he's doing, and you chap, at least you notice the samachs, and maybe you notice that it's coming from echa. But the question is, why are we starting the first kinah from ois samach and just continuing samach, ayin, pei? What's going on over here? And in fact, in the Ois V'Hadar, in their Mavois, so because they're incorporating other traditional Mekaydos, Yishayim Achrayim, even Chassidish Mekaydos, so they say that in Imri Pinchas HaShalem, Itaka cite a word from a Pinchas HaKaretz, Utaka noticed this, and he observed that Gemara in Bracha says that we don't have a nun in Ashrei, the Aleph Beis in Ashrei is missing the letter nun, and then instead it's Samech Hashem, Samach, and then there's a Rama, Samech Hashem, L'chol HaNoiflim. So, after Pinchas HaKaretz gesagt, that we just sat down on the ground for kinus, so that's the nun, that's nefila. So immediately we launch into Samech, Samach, so we start with Samach. So you see that he observed it, and that was how he sought to be masberit. Kommt Daniel Goldschmidt arrives and says that there's a much better or much more historical explanation, not to take away from the Vart. The Vart could still be applicable to the minhag as it is now. But if you want to understand historically how did Rabbi Elazar Kallir Taka come to begin seemingly from Ois Samach, so the answer is, what did we say? Which pasuk, which number is Ois Samach from in the prakim that have a single pasuk, a single letter? Pasuk Tezvav. Where did we say the kinus were in Shemona Esrei in the original minhag in Eretz Yisrael? In the 14th bracha. Bracha of Bnei Yerushalayim. As it happens, they actually used to combine the bracha of Bnei Yerushalayim and Samech, but that's not relevant, doesn't matter. It's still the 14th bracha, whether or not you're combining the next bracha into it or not. How did we say krevas work? A kreva is you add a short passage to each bracha in Shemona Esrei leading up to the part where you're going to have more of an arichas. So that means that in the kreva, and we mentioned the kreva, Zachar Echa Anu, which is preserved in the Machzor, Bnei Roimi, etc. So in Zachar Echa Anu, Zachar is the first word of the first pasuk of Perek Hey. Echa is the first word of the first pasuk of Perek Dalet. So essentially, the Kreva throughout Shemona Esrei followed that pattern, taka starting from pasuk Aleph. So in first bracha of Shemona Esrei, you said Zachar Echa Anu. And in the second bracha, the second pasuk Nachal Aseinu, and all the bases, and so on and so forth, going throughout Shemona Esrei. Then you get to the 14th bracha, and apparently, presumably, you also were mashlim the kreva. You did the 14th passage of the kreva, the regular kreva that you've been doing up until now. And now, once you've done that, now we're settling in on the 14th bracha, and now we're going to start doing kinus in earnest. So within this shift, now we're saying proper, straight, full kinus here in the 14th bracha. So now we start saying all of the rest. Shavas surumeni, nafloi denu b'tzil dechuya, samachayim pei tzadik, and all the rest. That is the kinah of the 14th bracha in Shemona Esrei, when you start saying kinus, following the kreva that was accompanying you throughout each bracha leading up to it. So in the original context, it was very clear, very understandable that you've been following this pattern throughout Shemona Esrei. Now we're up to Samech, let's do all the rest, Samech and pay a proper kinah. At some point, obviously in Ashkenaz especially, there was an erasure. We totally forgot. We erased the pattern of the kreva. Obviously, minhag bnei Romi, etc., preserved it, but otherwise, in Ashkenaz, that was erased. So the kreva is gone. And all we're left with is, weiter, it's taka, the first kinah, and we moved it, as we're discussing, was we didn't get to yet, but it was moved out of Shemoneh Esrei to after Shemoneh Esrei. So after Shemoneh Esrei, we begin kinus, and we begin Shavas Surumeni, which in its original context was culminating the buildup of the kreva throughout all the brachas, and now you've arrived in the bracha Yudalet, and like I said, now we've moved it out of that context. The kreva is gone. We moved it out of Shemoneh Esrei. We're beginning kinus after Kriyas HaTorah, but we still begin Shavas Surumeni. So that's the word that Goldschmidt is Meramaz here Bekitzer, and that Oisva Hadar Tak spells out and elaborates on Ba'arichas, like I said, to their credit. Back to Goldschmidt, he points out that at this point, the kinus were recited by the Chazan alone. Just as Chazar Sashatz is recited by the Chazan alone, and the kreva was also just for the Chazan to say within the context of Chazar Sashatz, so the kinus were as well. He doesn't spell it out, but one assumes perhaps that all the piyutim were intended that way, and in Bechlal, people didn't daven from Sidurim and Machzorim really until the printing press was invented. Obviously, I'm overgeneralizing here, and it could be that already at an earlier point it became more common for others to say the kinus as well, the piyutim as well, if they had access to that information. But obviously there would have been a large distinction between those who had access and had the capability of either memorizing it or having the text in front of them, compared to most people who probably would not have been able to pull that off. So it was, in fact, just the chazan. It's essentially a bit of a performance. Just like the Havdil, someone who performs on stage is expected to know the lyrics. So the chazan had a really serious job. The job wasn't necessarily even, today we associate a chazan with chazanas, with the melody. Lav dafka, that was the significance of the chazan. The significance of the chazan was that he had this skill that he could actually lead the congregation with all of these elaborate texts. And this is important to remember in general when one studies references to the shots or the chazan or whatever he's called at different times. But when you see Rishonim talking about the shots and the significance of the shots, you have to understand and remember that that was the significance of the shots. And we see this, he says, that in the Machzor of Roma and Romania, which, as we said, are the most loyal, are the closest also in the text to the original minhag Eretz Yisrael. So even as they printed the Machzor Roma and the Machzor Romania, that was still the Seder. The Seder apparently was that only the Chazan would recite it, not just Machzor Roma, but Kilas Italia in general. He says, Ad Zman Achen, he seems to be saying that it was the Chazan Dafka. So that is the origin of kinus and the minhag of saying kinus as it originated in Eretz Yisrael and as preserved in those machzorim. So how did we get to where we are today? So the way he presents it, and Yisrael Hadar follows him, they present it as yesh mi, someone who was Meshayr, that, as we said, the original format, maybe it was a single kreva, which is just adding single passages to brachas, and then a few kinus, a burst of kinus in one bracha. It's still not that much. But then as multiple Machabrim kept on writing kinus, and then the minhag became that you didn't stick to one author's kreva or one author's kinus, you started combining and compounding the kinus. That explains how the minhag outside of Italy and the Balkan nations, how the minhag changed in most European lands to the minhag that we're familiar with today. It doesn't make sense, doesn't fit anymore within the Amida. There's just too much to say, and they got relocated to La'achar Kriyas HaTorah. And since it's not a middle of Shemoneh Esrei, so we can sit down on the ground, so that's where that minhag originates. It can only originate once it's disconnected in its own separate unit. You sit down on the ground, and then you spend hours till Chatzos reciting all of those kinus, with regards to who recites them. So he says the Ashkenazim in Western Europe, the real Ashkenazim, Yekas. So Western Europe, the original piyutim, the layer of piyutim that originates from the Kallir, so that was still recited by the shots, or the chosh of Shabakol. And then the additional kinus, they were machabed other yechidim, but still individuals would recite it. In Eastern Europe, which is where we, or I assume most of the listening audience, and speaking for myself, where I'm coming from, we're coming from the Eastern European perspective, so that minhag disappeared as well, and there probably were similar processes, like I said, for other piyutim, and other occasions, other dates, and at some point, the minhag is now, we know this from Yom Neroim, even when it's still in the middle of Shemoneh Esrei, so Kavachomer, Kinos, which have been disconnected from Shemoneh Esrei, that the entire tzibur of Mispalim recites them together like the rest of davening. And he adds, once they disconnected Kinos from Shemoneh Esrei in the morning, so it made sense, they also added a few Kinos to the nighttime after Megillas Eicha, although, of course, that's just a few, 5, and the bulk of it is recited after Kriyas HaTorah. So this has all been Eretz Yisrael and Medinas Ashkenaz. What about Sfarad? We said that Sfarad was connected to Bavel, and in Bavel they didn't do kinus, they did slichos, and in Sfarad they also did slichos, but at some point Sfarad stopped doing slichos. So at some point even Sfarad transferred over to kinus. And the Paitanim in Sfarad also contributed over the hundreds of years many kinus. They too have the minhag to recite them while sitting on the ground, but there's an interesting distinction. The minhag there was to say it immediately after Shemoneh Esrei before Kriyas HaTorah, which more closely mirrors and tracks the evolution of slichos. Just as slichos were pushed from the middle of Shemoneh Esrei to immediately following Shemoneh Esrei, which is the minhag in Ashkenaz as well, if you're saying the slichos in the middle of davening. So the kinus operated the same way for them. They said the kinus immediately after Shemoneh Esrei. So in a certain sense, in Sfarad, slichos and kinus had the identical fate. Interestingly, he says, although the minhag of kinus did catch on in Spain, the piyutim of the Kallir, Taka never arrived, never reached, and that was not part. So their kovtzim of kinus is radically different than what we're familiar with, because we're not even starting with the same basis. We're not even starting with the same piyutim of the Kallir as the basis for the piyutim for the kinus. Back to Ashkenaz, in addition to the Kallir, and as we said before, the Kallir, we know of 50, he said, that the Kallir composed, but within our kovtzim, or at least at this point he's still referring to the original minhag Ashkenaz. In the original minhag Ashkenaz, there were 21 kinus from Elazar Kallir, which he does add is more or less the minhag till today with one minor switch. So 21 kinus of Elazar Kallir, or attributed to him, made it into minhag Ashkenaz. There are another 30 or more that are preserved in other machzorim, like we said. Rome, the old machzor Roim, had 42 from the Kallir. In the printed versions, they had 22. Of those 22, 15 overlap with the ones selected in the machzor Ashkenaz, etc. You can go on in this vein with the stats. But with regard to minhag Ashkenaz, in addition to those 21, many other kinus, many other piyutim were added on top of that. So what are the stats for that? So in Western Ashkenaz, they actually managed to reach a total of 60. In Eastern Europe, the total is 46. And of those 46 versus 60, 38 of them are identical overlap, including, like we said, the 21 or so from the Kallir. And with this, we have almost concluded this part of our discussion. I just want to add a few details that are taka helpfully added by Oiz V'Hadar in their presentation, their rendition of this presentation. So with regards to the slichos question, right, so as we observed, they observe as well the difference between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, and Sfarad originally versus Ashkenaz. So in Eretz Yisrael and later in Ashkenaz, they did not say slichos, they said kinus. So Goldschmidt just presents a matter of fact. But as V'Hadar mentions and emphasizes the rationale developed by the Rishonim in Ashkenaz, the Raviyah, who writes, for instance, and Raviyah cited in the Zerua, that he approves of the minhag that we don't say slichos. We say kinus. Why should we not say slichos? Because at the end of the day, Tisha B'av is called a moed, and if it's a moed, then we don't treat it like a regular tainis tzibur. Later, we are familiar with this argument as the basis for why we don't say tachnun on Tisha B'av. So if you're not saying tachnun, you're not saying slichos. It's the same logic, it's the same pattern of thought. So that's how it was justified and spelled out by the Rishonim and Ashkenaz. And you can go check both out, both Goldschmidt and Ezvahadar, for more details, more color, and more detailed discussions of the specific kinahs in general. Now I could leave the discussion there and move on to the next item on the agenda, but I guess I sort of feel that all of this was essentially very basic information. Anyone can really look up the Seder HaKinnos by Daniel Goldschmidt. It's just 2 pages of his Mavoi. Efsher is pastnish that we dedicated all that time just to information that could be considered to be so basic. Obviously, I think it's very valuable, very fundamental information, and I don't believe it's very common knowledge, and that's why I thought it was important to discuss. But just to go a bit beyond that, to go and give you a taste of some more advanced scholarship and discussion surrounding the piyutim, Elazar Kallir, for Tisha B'av. So I want to discuss 2 academic articles, one by Ezra Fleischer from the year 1974, and one from Avi Schmidman that was literally just published in 2 years ago, Tafshin Pei Aleph. Ezra Fleischer was a towering figure in the field of researching piyut. Goldschmidt himself essentially says that much of what he wrote is based on Ezra Fleischer's previous research. This particular piece by Fleischer from 1974 was published subsequent to Goldschmidt and references Goldschmidt's edition, and comes and adds additional points, additional dimensions, additional information and data, and does much to round out the picture. Fleischer begins by emphasizing how much Elazar Kallir's contribution to Tisha B'av has not been fully appreciated yet, has not been fully comprehended yet. He calls attention immediately to the proportions. He says, second to Yom Kippur, there's no other day on the calendar that Rabbi Elazar Kallir contributed such a great deal to. The quantity and the quality of Rabbi Elazar Kallir's writings, compositions for Tisha B'av is staggering. He says scholars already back in the 1850s, 1860s were amazed by how many kinahs essentially there are by Elazar Kallir for Tisha B'av, and that's before the Geniza. After the Cairo Geniza, it's only added many more, much more to our knowledge, our understanding of this whole subject. And essentially, as of the time of publication, at the time, he says that there are many more kinahs in the Geniza that seemingly can be identified as belonging to the Kallir, which hadn't been published yet at the time. And he adds and emphasizes it's not just the impressive number, and it's not just the variety of the format, the techniques, the literary techniques, the variety that he uses for all the various kinahs, but also, he says, the thematic abundance, right? And I didn't get into that at all, but the mavos to the Seder HaKinnos, they get into the themes of the piyutim, right? Are you just throwing a bunch of words, or what imagery, what concepts, what themes are you using within your piyutim? And Elazar Kallir is very creative and uses a large variety of themes within the kinahs that we are familiar with, and one supposes as well as with the ones that we're not familiar with. So all these aspects together really shed so much light on how amazing Rabbi Elazar Kallir's contribution to Tisha B'av really is. Fleischer goes on to emphasize some of what we've already seen before, that the nature of the kinahs was that they were essentially coming in the footsteps after one went through the kroiva of Shmoneh Esrei, one then arrived at the kinahs. The kinahs, in that sense, he says, are simpler, shorter piyutim that sort of just elaborate, expand, complete the kroivas, the build-up that had occurred up until that point in Shmoneh Esrei, up until the bracha of Beinu Yerushalayim, or the combined bracha, like Hey Davidu Beinu Yerushalayim, as we mentioned, the minhag in Eretz Yisrael. Originally, the kinah couldn't be conceived of without the context of the kroiva. The kroiva and the kinah were tied together, and there was no such concept of just an individual piyut. It had to be a segment, a part of a larger composition. and that composition had to be pegged and attached to the entire tefillah. In my own words, I would perhaps use the analogy of classical music, lahavdil, in the sense that generally famous composers compose these long, elaborate compositions with multiple parts, multiple pieces. And often certain parts and certain pieces become more famous and they eclipse their original context, their original origin. But in their original context, they are simply a piece of a larger work. And the same goes for the piyutim and the kinos here, that they have to be understood as originally being part of a larger composition. In a footnote, by the way, he reiterates the fact that the kinah was an Eretz Yisrael thing and not a Bavel thing. And Bavel did the slichos and the sixth bracha, as we discussed. And that means that there's a difference between how a slicha is built and how a kinah is built, and the slichos are tied to the Yud Gimel Midas. And he emphasizes that even though in Bavel the whole concept of piyutim was a bit less of a thing, I guess particularly on Shabbos and Yom Tovim, he says especially when they felt that it was replacing the regular davening, but even in Bavel they had been very much all along in favor of slichos on fast days, Eshanos and Sukkos, and the Seder Avodah and slichos of Yom Kippur. So just a bit more insight there on what's going on in Bavel versus Eretz Yisrael. He mentions, as Goldschmidt had alluded to, that there are 5 entire krevis from the Kallir for Tisha B'av. 2 of them had been preserved in various European minhagim. As we mentioned, one that was in Italy and Romania, as we discussed. The second one had originally been in the ancient minhag Ashkenaz before it was forgotten. And the other 3 were revealed, are from the revelations, in the Gniza. I should pause to note, by the way, that the name of the essay is Kompozitziot Kalliriot Tisha B'av. I should have mentioned it at the beginning, but it was an oversight, so I'm mentioning it now. But back to the presentation. Fleischer once again uses very strong words to emphasize how wonderful these krevis are. He says all of Kallir's krevis for Tisha B'av are monumental, and even the simpler ones indicate that it wasn't just a throwaway framework for his kinnas, but he really invested much work, much effort to really perfect these krevis. And that's just the simple ones, and they only get more complicated and elaborate. Muflaot, more kavot, mesulsalot are the words he uses. And in the first section of this essay, he discusses one of these krevis from the Gniza, Ahali Eicha B'Shali Huzam. He says it's his impression that there is no other compositional creation, not earlier, not later, that is more complicated in the framework of the structure that Kallir imposed upon himself. He goes on to describe how it's structured. If you were paying attention earlier with regard to the kreva we discussed above, so it's not that different. So the first word, Ahali, comes from a pasuk in Yirmiyah. So he's using words from that pasuk. And then the beginning of the first line after the word from that pasuk is the first Eicha, the first word of the first pasuk of the first parak in Eicha. And the second line is from the first word of the second parak of Eicha, and then the third, fourth, and fifth line are from the 3 aleph from Eicha parak Gimel. And it doesn't stop there. It actually continues as a 6th line, a 7th line, an 8th line, and there's so much more going on. And there's an acrostic for his name. And I'm not even going to go through all the elements. So it's like, as he said, this is his most complex in terms of these rules that he imposed upon himself. But it's not just the framework that's so complex. Thematically, it's very complex as well. He's meramis to the mazalas, which we know from another piyut, from another kinah in the kinos, meramis to mazalas, meramis to the months, meramis to the mishmaris of kahuna, mishmaris of levia, shvatim. He says the mishmaris halavia is particularly exceptional, very unusual. It's the only kinah except for one other one. And as we saw with the kreva that we discussed earlier, it's a kreva of 14. It builds up till the 14th bracha, and then that's where the kreva ends, and then the kinah picks up and finishes all the other parts of the aleph beis, as we saw similarly before. And then he goes on to reproduce the entire kreva in its entirety with a commentary. I guess this was the first time it had been published in such a format. Obviously, we're not going to go through the whole thing, but I just want to, since it's right in front of me, I'm going to read just the first one, so just so you get the flavor of how it fits into the bracha. So one assumes one began, Baruch Atah Hashem, L'keinu K'Yavisenu, L'kei Avram, etc. And then there's Ali Echa B'Shalihuz Echa Boihin Bicht La'avrei and so on and that forth. It mentions Kefasach Ben Nisan, Ken Yeshiam, so that's referencing Nisan. But also Hin Bicht La'av is a remez to Mazel Tala, as we mentioned, that it mentions the Mazalas as well. And there's Achloi Sha'am Mimiroin Mish'am, so he says Miroin is like Miron, and that's Merames to the Mishmeres Yehoyarev, who were based in Miron, so that's the remez to the Mishmeres Kahuna. And there's Echa Asaf Nok Shikar. Asaf, he says, is a remez to Mishmeres Alaviyah. And then the next line, Knupatz Berish Goylem Bechar, that's a remez to Shevet Reuven. And it concludes, L'goynenam Na Yom Zachar, and then under it, Baruch Atah Hashem, Magen Avram. So you have these double passages, 2 passages, and then the bracha, 2 passages, and then the bracha, and so on in this vein, following that whole framework that we described, or part of which we described, and incorporating all of those different themes, stringing it through the poetry. In the second part of the article, he touches on the question of assigning the kinah to krevis. Since the Kallir has so many kinahs, surely you weren't intended to say all of them at once, as Goldschmidt mentioned as well. And back when they were only aware of the 2 krevis, so they assumed that you had to fit all the kinahs, all the known kinahs into 2. But now that we know that there are 5, so now, but also we know there are many more kinahs as well. So maybe it's more than 10 per kreva, as I conjectured before, whatever the case is. But Fleischer reiterates what we already saw from Goldschmidt, that surely the Kallir had essentially created multiple parallel, what he calls machzorim, at different periods of time. Obviously, it takes time to work on krevis and kinahs. Probably different years. He composed new compositions for that particular year. So one year he wrote a kreva and a string of kinahs that are supposed to follow that kreva. Another year he did another one. Each one is its own machzer. However, Fleischer says it would be geschmack if we could tag and figure out, okay, this string of kinahs belongs to this kreva, this string. But that's not, in fact, the reality is that we can't really work it out. At least at that time it wasn't possible. However, sometimes it's possible to try to guess at least which kinahs are attached to each other. In the Seder kinahs as we have it right now, you can see how, particularly in the Kallir's kinahs, there are endings that sort of tie the end of the previous one to the beginning of the next one. However, even that's not so simple because not all of them are original. Perhaps they were rearranged and people made fake segues later. But what he wants to do here, the point he wants to make is that in this kreva ali echa b'shali huzam, which, as he emphasized, in addition to all the words from echa, also uses a pasuk from Yirmiyah. So he points out that there are a number of kinahs that he found, I believe all in the Geniza, where they also seem to follow a similar format with Yirmiyah and echa. And his theory, therefore, is that those kinahs likely would have followed, as we mentioned, the kreva itself has its own conclusion, where you're sort of concluding the aleph base of that kreva, but then there were additional kinahs that followed in sequence that can be, that one can suppose, belonged, and were all part of one long composition. In fact, he points out that some of them were incorporated into some old minhagim of Sidrei kinahs in different lands, although I don't think any of them would be familiar to us, plus what was found in the Geniza. He then goes on to discuss their characteristics in great detail and to attempt to demonstrate how one would be able to show how one ties into the next, not just that they follow the same general pattern, but that the ending of one fits nicely with the beginning of the next, of what he's suggesting is the next. It then goes on to describe the individual kinahs and their format and what framework was used, like we said before, which words are being taken from where to create the framework and the format for the text of the kinah. And then he goes on to the theme. So the theme of the first one is the 10 masois that the Shekhinah traveled as it distanced itself from the Beis HaMikdash, which is a theme that appears in Midrashim as well. The theme of the second one in his list is particularly interesting, and he emphasizes that it's taka very interesting and it hasn't drawn sufficient attention up until the point when he wrote this. Essentially what he calls a luach tzoimos, a list of other fast days, lesser known fast days, which he then goes on to discuss of how we have different lists, different sources of various additional fast days, Yud Nisan, the Patir of Miriam, Yud Chasir, the Patir of Yeshua, Chavta Sivan, the Patir of Shmuel, of course, Shabbos, Shabbetai Tisha B'av, Hey El, the death of Shimon Gamliel and Rabbi Shmuel, of course, Gimel Tishri Tzem Gedalia, and so on and so forth in this vein. So he says this piyut is following along the lines of these types of lists, although it's confined by the fact that it's limited to 12, so it has to pick one per month, even if there might be multiple known Tanesim for a particular month. But that's the theme that's incorporated into what we've already been saying a kinah about Tisha B'av. So we had many tzaras, and we have many tzoimis to commemorate those tzaras. So integrating that as the theme for the kinah, very interesting. The theme of the third piyut, the third kinah, is each one contains one of the Aseres HaDibros, and one of the 10 kronos, which is mentioned in the Medrash as well, that there's the Karen of Karna Shel Avram, Karna Shel Yitzchak, Karna Shel Yosef, etc., and so on. As well as it contains a coil of the koilos that were heard from Yerushalayim to Yericho, Bizman Shabbos HaMikdash Kayim, which is mentioned in Mishnayos. And he goes on to describe this in some detail and the differences versus the Mishnah and all that. Then he goes on to actually reproduce all of these piyutim with a commentary as well. I just want to read a few lines from the second piyut with the list of the tzoimis, because I think that's interesting. So in the second passage of the second piyut, Ali Eicha Gilu Kadeshan, so this is where he introduces his concept. Shudad, Gada, Tzoin, Nime Asar, Tzoimis Vataniyas Midor Ledor Limsar, Darach Me'oz Besin, Nevi Lesar, B'chedesh Harishon Ba'asar. So that's where he introduces the concept and alludes to the Tzoim of the Patir of Miriam, and so on in that vein. There's a bit more to the article afterwards, but we'll leave it at that. But just to illustrate some of the additional information and data and text that was published subsequent to the publication of Goldschmidt's Kinos. And now to take a look at Schmidman's piece from 2 years ago, Ha'omnam Shimshu Kinos Eretz Yisraelius Betur Slichos B'minhag Bavel. So this gets even more interesting, and one can say more complicated, although we'll try to keep it simple. But as we mentioned, this is the minhag Eretz Yisrael, the minhag Bavel. Eretz Yisrael is Kinos, Bavel is Slichos. However, the question is, were Kinos from Eretz Yisrael repurposed as slichos in the Bavel system? Begins by mentioning a number of interesting points. First of all, just as a general piece of information, Kinos and slichos are the most common piyutim in the Cairo Gniza. Very interesting. I guess you could say that's a parallel observation to the previous articles, beginning by saying that Elazar Kallir, within his own output, Kinos are way up there. And I guess you could draw a parallel to the fact that our kovtzim of Kinos for Tisha B'av is really unlike any other grouping of piyutim that we say on any other occasion. So this idea of Kinos being special and exceptional in quantity, the is sort of a through line through whether it's Elazar Kallir's output or the Cairo Gniza or the piyutim that we actually recite. Interestingly, he notes that we're differentiating in the actual nature. The slichos and kinos are, at least in theory, two fundamentally different things that are structured differently. He points out that we actually have proof of there being kinos for asar b'tevis and shiur asar b'tamas as well, although very few have made it survive to this day and age. But he references a previous essay, a previous article he wrote in Tafshin Ayin Daled, Kinos Shabbetai Beer, so that is also very interesting. He then goes on to mention the Selichos and Bavel, and he makes just an interesting point. I alluded earlier to the fact that we differentiate. There are certain Selichos that are seemingly a given, that they are recited before davening, in the middle of the night. In Chabad, that's El. For others, there might be Seres Yemei Tshuva as well, or perhaps the whole Chodesh El. So he observes that this distinction actually goes all the way back, and these slichos, which again is more of a Bavel thing, slichos were composed for all the fast days and for early mornings. So for Yom Kippur, it's incorporated into Birchas Kedushas Hayoim Ata Kodesh of the Amidah of Musaf. And the slichos for the other fast days, as we already discussed, were incorporated in the sixth bracha of the weekday Shemoneh Esrei Slach Lanu. However, for the other occasions, Elul, Tishrei, whatever, those slichos were all the way back, going back to the beginning to begin with, were not intended to be part of Shemoneh Esrei, but had always been their own independent events that took place taka early in the morning, Chodesh El, Seres Yemei Tshuva, and as we mentioned before, slichos by definition focus a lot more on regret for sin, asking for forgiveness, and things along those lines. And in a footnote, he points out very interestingly that as to the actual term, if you go back to Bavel, slichos was actually used specifically for fast days, the piyutim we're talking about in Shemoneh Esrei, and the piyutim, they said early morning, were not originally called slichos, they were called rachmim, psukei derachmei, hashmoides, tachanunim, which is interesting. Obviously that distinction hasn't held up, and of course dafka, the ones for El, Tishrei, are perhaps more well known today as slichos. So as we said, Tisha B'av is a very popular topic, so there are a lot of kinahs and there are a lot of slichos, and he points out that Fleischer, before him, had already pointed out that even the slichos and Bavel for Tisha B'av didn't always stick to the themes and motifs of slichos, and often veered into what we would consider kinahs territory, just focusing on the churban as opposed to tshuva. So therefore, in which case, there really isn't such a fundamental distinction between slichos and kinahs, and it's just a question of what your minhag was, where you placed them in davening, in which case a kinah could also be a slicha. And he quotes Fleischer as saying elsewhere that indeed there were kinahs from Eretz Yisrael that became slichos in Bavel for Tisha B'av. And this essay is his attempt to explore that in greater detail. He then goes on to say that he wants to test that assertion and see if it's true or to what extent it's true. He explains how it's not so simple. Looking at the manuscripts themselves, not always easy to identify what's going on. And how would you know if it's a kinah or a slicha just by looking at it? Sometimes there are more obvious clues. If you can see it in the context of the kreva, then you can see where in the kreva it belongs, how far the kreva goes. Or if it's slichos and it says Keil Melech, so then you know it's clearly slichos. But that itself isn't always included. The information isn't always included in the manuscripts. Interestingly, in the footnote he mentions with regards to this distinction of Kinos and Eretz Yisrael and Slichos and Bavel, so Slichos did ultimately arrive in Eretz Yisrael, but they only arrived in Eretz Yisrael, according to current scholarship, at the end of the 8th century, the end of the 700s. So just to be more precise and more nuanced about Slichos and Bavel versus Slichos and Eretz Yisrael. Then after listing his methods, he then goes on to list a bunch of known kinahs and which krevis they belong to. And based on that, he's able to confirm that there is at least one instance of which a known kinah then reappeared as part of slichos. And now the question is, so does that mean that it's a widespread phenomenon, or adrabah, it's a rare phenomenon? That's, of course, more of a question for academics. It's an academic question. And it's in the context of this question that he then goes on to discuss the nuances of the minhag and Bavel. He points out the original Bavel minhag, which the Goyenim described, was that Shemoneh Esrei was the regular Shemoneh Esrei, not the whole concept of kroivus that they had in Eretz Yisrael. Then when they got to Slach Lanu, they said a Seder Slichos, and then straight back to straight regular Shemoneh Esrei. That's what you see with Reb Sadra Goyen and Reb Amram Goyen and other Tshuvas Goyenim. But within the Geniza, we see an evolution that there is also a musig, a concept in Bavel of saying slichos within a kroiva, that there was a kroiva for Shemona Esrei, which then led you to the slichos. Then goes on to describe how there are multiple kisviyad that attest to this phenomenon, specifically with Tisha B'av, how you have slichos within krevis for Tisha B'av in Bavel. And where do those krevis come from? Those krevis came from Eretz Yisrael. Now the question is, how did this work? The Krev of Eretz Yisrael has all these kinahs in the 14th bracha. The minhag in Bavel is to say all these slichos in the 6th bracha. So what happens when you transfer the Krev from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel? So he says we can find attestation in manuscripts that there were some who actually were doing both side by side. Because they copied the Krev from Eretz Yisrael, they continued saying the slichos in the 6th bracha in the context of the Krev, plus all the kinahs in the 14th bracha. This can explain why we're not finding too many Eretz Yisrael kinahs turning into slichos, because the kinahs were left in the 14th bracha. And that's all coming in addition to the already existing slichos for the 6th bracha. So the kinahs don't replace the slichos are the slichos, the kinahs are the kinahs, and they're saying everything. And he adds that this minhag is attested to not just mizman hagoyim, but there's actually an actual manuscript dated within itself, says Shnas Aleph Tov Mem Tes L'Shtaris, which translates as the year 1137. As of 1137, there still was someone or some people who were following this old minhag of Seder Slichos and Kinos for Tisha B'av. And from there, he takes the discussion even further and goes to even more advanced levels of discussion, which I think will spare us. We'll spare the listeners for now. Definitely check it out if this kind of thing interests you. But here's a taste of literally the latest cutting-edge research into this whole phenomenon of kinahs versus slichos and the minhagim and Bavel and all of that. Moving on now to the next topic that I mentioned, the concept, the old minhag of saying kinahs on the Shabbosim leading up to Tisha B'av, similar, I said you could say, like the Daled Parshiyos. So in the Tshuvos Radbaz, in the common Tfus, it's marked with two numbers, either Elef Ayin, 1070, or the number Tafresh Mem Hey, 645. The Radbaz says, Sha'alta mimeni, you asked, you wanted my opinion, but Meshenogu b'roiv glilos Yisrael, that the minhag in most Jewish communities, or at least in that part of the world, Begimel Shabbos hasmuches l'Tisha B'av, Loimar Krevitz. Krevitz is a variation of the word Krevos, the Kreva that we've been talking about. They have the minhag to say Krevitz, Zeichel l'Churban, on those three Shabbosos. Chubru Mezeh, Kama, Ma'oiris, V'Kadishin, Ubarchu, V'Nishmas Kol Chai. So essentially, as I mentioned before, you have piyutim for Shemona Esrei, but you also have piyutim for Birchas Kriyas Shema. And depending on where in Birchas Kriyas Shema they are, or even in Nishmas and Baruchu before Birchas Kriyas Shema, that's the nickname that the piyutim got. So that's what those different terms are referencing. So these were piyutim and kinahs that were inserted into that part of davening. But kulam al derech kinah v'zeichel l'churban, they all have the tone of kinahs. The Ishba, Mechibur Yehuda Alevi, Reb Shlomo ben Gebirol, the great Sephardi Paitanim, Bezulasam, and others. Im Yafei Moisim, this is a good thing. V'im mivatlinan lahu, or is this something that we could or should cancel? So the Radbaz Tshuva Yasher Chele Laman the Yavatul Davar Kazeh. I would approve and thank someone who could cancel this. It should be cancelled. Shavach Lekel for Nesbatul Minhag Zeba Mitzrayim. Thankfully, this has been cancelled in Mitzrayim. And also the Mistarav, the more Arabian Jews, don't have this minhag. So seemingly it was more of a Spanish thing. And he's saying that even, he himself was, of course, of Spanish heritage, and he was part of the great wave of the Girosh that spread true Sephardi Spanish minhag across the Middle East. So clearly, he's referencing the minhag Sfarad, and he's saying that the minhag was Nisbatul Mitzrayim, presumably among even Yotzei Sfarad, and V'gam Mistarav Loinogu, because presumably he means that the Arabian Jews never had this minhag to begin with, because it was a Spanish thing, not an Arabian thing. And he goes on to say, "V'kamer herchikur azal tza'ako b'chiyah b'Shabbos." Look what Chazal said. Kol sheken leimar divrei kinos lahasker churban, to cry. That's what the kinos are for, right? You're trying to get people to cry, which is a point I think that gets made in different contexts. So he just mentions that in passing. And of course, Tisha B'av itself is nidcha when it is chal on Shabbos. So you're being doicha Tisha B'av itself, you should be doicha the kinos. And even dvarim shebetzino are not noyeg on Tisha B'av shechol yis b'Shabbos l'das reiv poiskim. So kol shkein, we're talking about Shabbos before Tisha B'av. Kol shkein to say kinos, which are per hesya. What about the mechabrim? And the assumption he makes here is that the mechabrim were mechaber them for those parts of davening. Shema, and this is also interesting and gets mentioned in different places, b'shem the Radbaz. The Radbaz makes the point, Shema lehayu bali heira, ela mesherim. Who's to say that the Paitanim are mumchim in halacha? Maybe their claim to fame is that they knew how to write songs and poetry. This is a larger question about the significance of piyutim and the importance of piyutim, and the Radbaz, at least in this very narrow, specific context, sort of drops that line that, who's to say they know what they're doing. And he concludes, reiterates, Soif, Ein Roy Laharis Shum Daiga, V'le Yitzavin B'Shabbos, Ala Kerl Simcha. It's got to be Simcha. Mishiyucha Lavato Minhag Zeh, Yafu Waisa. Uvad Shaloy Al Yedei Machlekas. Cancel it, but don't, if it's going to cause strife, then that's not worth it. She'en Lecha Dover Ebed Lefnei Machlekas. But otherwise, cancel the minhag. V'lei Nachash LeMinhag, don't be concerned, it's the minhag. Kiven Shu Be'Isser, when the minhag is Be'Isser, then the minhag can be deleted. And to prove this, he quotes a Ritva. He says, the Ritva says, Av ha-minhag lahakal la'olam ein chayshishin lai. I'm not looking up what the context was, but a certain minhag lahakal, Ritva says, is not to be taken into consideration. Even if the greatest gedolim supported the minhag lahakal, kol shenira b'yitzad isser l'chacham bal heira sheyiyah b'yom mahem. If the Chacham at any given time thinks there's a problem, it's problematic, there's an isser, that's enough to say, out with the minhag. You got to follow the Chacham, the Shofet, who's here now. That's the quote, and the Radbaz concludes, so this is this interesting tshuva of the Radbaz. So now the question is, first of all, can we find these piyutim? Second of all, did those mechabrim, did those mesherim, Taka compose them for that particular purpose or not? And third of all, where did the minhag come from? What's Taka pshat? What's going on over here? So the answer to the first question is that if you want to find the piyutim and kinah and slichos, minhag Sephardim from Sfarad, for the various tinius, so there is a chibur that was printed throughout the centuries called Seder Arba Tinius. Within Oitzer HaChachma alone, if you search for Seder Arba Tinius, they have one that they date to the year Shin Pei Daled in Venice. So that would be 1624. They have one they date to Taf Yud Ches Amsterdam. That would be 1658. And they have one that they date to Tafresh Yud Daled Livorno. That's much later, 1854. And I didn't check all of them page by page, but they all seem to track pretty closely to each other. So that's where you would find the minhag Sephardim that's relevant to this discussion. And you look at the Sharblat, Seder Arba Tinius, Halehei, Masara B'Tevis, Tzoyim Esther, Shavasa B'Tamas B'Tisha B'av, Nidpas B'Venezia, Habira, etc. So if you go ahead and look at any of them, whether Shin Pei Daled or Tafresh Daled, you'll find that after what they call Tikkun Shiva Aser B'Tammuz, they have their slichos, their piyutim for Shiva Aser B'Tammuz. The next thing you find is Tikkun Shabbosos. And it's divided into 3 Shabbosos, named after the Haftarah. So the first 3 pages are for Shabbos Divrei, and the next 3 or 4 pages are for Shabbos Shimu. And then the third one they call Shabbos Eicha. Interestingly, not Shabbos Chazoin. And that's a bit longer. There's about 6 pages of piyutim for Shabbos Eicha. If you break it down a bit, so you see Tikkun Shabbosos for Shabbos Divrei begins with a Rishos. Rishos is sort of an introductory piyut. Divrei Neviim ho asidus yadu me'az b'chol am ho alekim nishmo leimor letzurchem halavavis kiru ach amlu lirik v'lashav yagu, and so on in that vein. Then there's a second Rishos, like an alternate Rishos. Then there's for Nishmas, And it begins with the word nishmas. Nishmas shdudim nedudim ba'artzis moinim, and so on in that vein. There's a short one for Kaddish, there's one for Baruchu, and then La'ata Har'esa. Then for Shabbos Shimud, there's Rishus, then there's for Nishmas, for Kaddish, for Baruchu, for Ata Har'esa. But then there's more for Shabbos Shimud, because then there's one for Hacharaza Soresh Chodesh Av. So after Kriyas HaTorah, presumably when you get to what they call Hacharazas Chodesh Av, there's a special, particularly lengthy one, lengthier than all the rest. The others were pretty short. There are a few lines each, 2 stanzas, 3 each. This one's a bit longer. Ashacher adasi v'lam oid aniya ve'efked nevosi v'rabba she'iyah. And the last stanza is Mechadish Chadashim Yekabetz Kadoshim Anoshim Anoshim Le'ir Abnuya V'zeh HaChodesh L'Tevi Yechadish V'rotzen Yitzav El Rav HaAlilia. At least it ends on a positive note, and it's referencing Mechadish Chadashim heading into the Misha Asa and Taka in small letters V'oimer Misha Asa Nisim. And now we get to Shabbos Eicha, and Shabbos Eicha is far longer than the others. For starters, it begins all the way by Baruch She'omar, so P'tach Pi Lahodos, and the beginning of each one references where it is. So P'tach Pi Lahodos, and it goes into Baruch She'omar. And then once again, interestingly, they include an alternate one. Then there's the Rishus, they call it Rishus L'Nishmas. And I should point out, by the way, if it wasn't obvious before, that the beginning of the Rishus references the Shabbos. So the Rishus for Shabbos Divrei, Al Shem the Haftarah, Divrei Yemayahu. So that Rishus began Divrei Nevi'im. The Rishus for Shabbos Shimu began Shimu v'hazinu v'adabra ani. And the Rishus for Shabbos Eicha, because they call it Shabbos Eicha, not Shabbos Chazayin, so the Rishus begins Eich Mishkanei Elyon. And there's one for Nishmas, Nishmas Amunim, for Kaddish, for Baruchu, for Ata Har'esa, an alternate for Ata Har'esa. So all of this was faithfully reproduced in the Seder Arbatanius through the centuries, through the mid-1800s, because this was part of the Sephardic heritage. So that's with regards to where you can find it and what the content looks like, what's the substance of these piyutim. Now, as to the question as to whether they were composed especially, and it would seem like they are because they're customized to the part of davening, but now the question is, who really composed them? Are they really from Yehuda Levi, etc.? So if you search, you can pick the beginnings of different piyutim and see if they come up, where they come up from. So if you take, for example, from the first Shabbos, Shabbos Divrei, and the one for Ata Har'esa, begins Yoina Nechava, Nafsha Dava. So if you search Yoina Nechava, so you'll find there's a set Shirei HaKodesh LaRabbi Yehuda Halevi, the Yarden edition, and you look at volume 2, Shirei HaKodesh LaRabbi Yehuda Halevi, Apikis V'Yarut Fusim, Pirush, Bekodesh, Makbilos, Mavim Aftachis Miloin, Bibliographia. Me'ez, Dr. Dov, Yarden, Kerech Sheni, Moyedei Akayet. So you could start by just looking in the table of contents, the Rishimas Hashirim. So you have Shabbos Agadol, Pesach, Shabbos Bahar, Shabbos Lifnei Shavuos, a lot for Shavuos, and then, sure enough, Shabbos Divrei, Shabbos Shimu, Shabbos Chazayin, Tisha B'av, Shabbos Ekev, Shabbos Chasan, Slichos La'ashmuris, which we just touched on from Schmidman. So Shabbos Divrei, there's one, Yerushalayim Karma. Shabbos Shimu, there's one, Yom HaKolu. For Shabbos Chazayin, here they call it Shabbos Chazayin, they have a grand total of 14. Looking at the actual individual piyutim, if you look at the Shabbos Divrei, so I said it's called Yerushalayim Karma, so as the name suggests, it's actually written in Aramaic, which itself is interesting. I'm not checking Yehuda Levi's divan right now to see how much Aramaic output he had, but the whole concept of Aramaic piyutim, long after Aramaic ceased to be a spoken language, is itself a very fascinating topic with many aspects and facets to it, but that's the one we have for Shabbos Divrei is in Aramaic, Yerushalayim Karma. My guess perhaps is that it's meant to be especially suitable for going into Kaddish, so perhaps it was for Kaddish. It concludes Birchan Alochu Shlomo. Then there's the one for Shabbos Shimu. Then there are the bunch for Shabbos Chazayin, once again suggesting that Shabbos Chazayin or Shabbos Eicha, there were more, starting earlier in davening perhaps. And sure enough, the third one here is Yoina Nichava, that we saw in the Seder Arbatanius. although there they'd set it for the first Shabbos, here it's set for the third Shabbos. One of them begins with Nishmas, clearly for Nishmas. One of them begins with Eicha Klilas Yoifi, which I would suspect might be a Rishus, although I see they call it a Kreva. Not going to drill too deeply into that. But actually there's a sequence here of pieces, and they mark and say, okay, this one's for Magen, this one's for Mechaya. And there's actually a whole V'chein L'chasal Kedusha, Ki Ata Kel Melech Moichitz V'roife, so also continuation of this Kreva for the Kedusha. So at any rate, the point is that you look in Shiri HaKodesh, Yehuda Levi, and there it's organized very nicely. And yeah, clearly Yehuda Levi was composing these pieces for these Shabbos. It looks like his version of Shabbos Chazon was even more elaborate than the Seder Arba Tinius, than the minhag preserved there. But more or less, they're along the same continuum of course, there are piyutim that are written to fit with the theme of these Shabbos, which is that they are essentially kinah, maybe not as dreary as kinah proper, maybe they're a bit lighter, I suppose you might say, but still the theme certainly is the Churban. Which leads us to the third question. Where did this come from? Where did this originate? What's happening here? So, at least as of this moment, I didn't find something long and systematic from the last bunch of decades, but I did find something from the 1940s, Reshumot, Ma'asaf le'Divrei Zichronot le'Ethnografia u'le'Folklore b'Yisrael. So a bit lighter than heavy academic stuff, but still, I guess you could say semi-academic. This was printed in Tel Aviv in 1947. And there's an article there by Yom Tov Levinsky, HaShabbos HaMyuchoses v'Minhag Yisrael. And pretty quickly into it, he mentions the Shalosh HaShabbos, if you may be in Mitzara. And he writes, Bimei ha'go'onim kfor yodu tfilos v'yotzres miyuchadim l'shabbos elu. The minhag begins from the era of the go'onim, and in the Siddur of Saja Goin, there are passages for Ma'ariv for the Shabbos HaParanos, and Yotzres for Shachris, and the Piyutim that are miyuchas to Reb Saja Goin. You can see how he interpolated words referencing those haftarahs, like we saw earlier in the minhag Sfarad. So there you have Divrei, Agar ben Yaakov, Shemu, Goyim, Eicha, or it gives a few other examples, all from Siddur Absaja Goyin. So it's essentially an or altum minhag that goes back to Bavel. Whereas in Eretz Yisrael, he asserts, they did not say any kinah on these Shabbos, that this was not the minhag in Eretz Yisrael. And he goes on to say the Mitzrayim, they had the minhag, and then there was a snagdus charifa, it was nisbatel. He quotes the Radbaz, quotes the Chidah, mentions that in Izmir, this is just jumping around a bit, he's jumping around a bit. In Izmir, they taught the children in Cheder, especially melancholy nagunim, that covered these Shabbos. And then he adds, talking about minhag Sfarad, so the Sfardim also reached Western Europe. So you have Amsterdam, Hamburg, and all that. So in those Kehillas which followed minhag Sfarad, so they would call these Shabbos by the Rosh Tevis, Shabbos the Shach. And he says in Holland, as a result, they called it in their spoken language the Dashach Shabbosim, which sounds like it turned into Yiddish syntax. So he's framing it as a Sephardi thing, but they ended up calling it the Shach Shabbosim. He says, although at some point they stopped knowing what it was even referring to, no one even chapped what the Dashach meant, that it's a Rosh Tevis of the three haftarahs. He writes in a footnote that when someone in Holland would ask in the Beis Medrash, what's Dashach? What are we calling? The Shach Shabbosim. So the Chavre, they would answer, Dashach is Rosh Tevis, du shtumer chamor, you chamor shoita. And he says, Mipi, Dr. So-and-so, that this is an anecdote shared by someone from Holland. So just a cute little anecdote there about how a particular evolution of the reference to these Shabbosim in the Amsterdam community, which was influenced by Sfarad. And he goes on and he goes through each Shabbos individually, the different potential piyutim, yes, no, Shabbos Shimu, Do you say mechadash chadashim? Do you not? Interestingly, he says that the minhag among the Sephardim was that for the first Shabbos, Shabbos Divrei, they wouldn't do laundry. For the second Shabbos, Shabbos Shimu, which is also Shabbos Mevarchim, they would do laundry for the next two Shabboses. And he says the Olam would say that what's the mocker that Shabbos Shimu you are allowed, because in the Haftarah it says Ki im techabsi b'neser v'sar bilach burrs. It's referencing laundry. So they were matir for Shabbos Shimu, which is interesting. And with regards to the third Shabbos, he points out that the Goyim called it Shabbos Eicha. And apparently he says that they even read Megillas Eicha that Shabbos. He says that in Psikta Rabasi, there isn't Haftaras Chazain. It's not Shabbos Chazain, because there's no Haftaras Chazain. In fact, the Haftaras, the Psiktas, are from Ksuvim. Al Naris Bavel and Bochis Sifka Balayla from Eicha. Which is interesting. I'm not checking all the claims and assertions here, and I would generally prefer to double check with a better source, but definitely sounds interesting. And indeed, as we saw from the Seder Arbatinius, he's quoting from Sidra B'Sajagoyin, so you can see clearly from the Piyutim themselves that the Shabbos was called Shabbos Eicha, and the idea is that you connect the theme of the Parsha, of Parsha's Dvarim, where it also says Eicha, and the Eicha from the Haftarah, and the Eicha from Megillas Eicha, so it's all keeping with the theme of Shabbos. The theme is Eicha. Then discusses Shabbos Chazain at great length. He adds that in some Kehilas in Galicia and Bessarabia, not only did they wear big deichayil, but they looked for dafka tzirisin kleder, tattered clothing, and gave it the nickname Shabbos Dranki, or Shabbos Dronki, which apparently means tatters. The source from Galicia pronounced it Dranki, and the source from Bessarabia pronounced it Dronki. He also mentions that in slang and idiom, when something looked particularly dark and dreary, they would say, looks like the Parechos of Shabbos Chazayin, and he quotes Yud Lamed Peretz, who writes, the whole day the sky had an ashy color, and people said, it's the Parechos of Shabbos Chazayin. B'chol the Benegel Inyanenu, we're looking for Hasber, so the way he wrote it is very geschmack, that the minhag goes all the way back to Bavel, and Azit feared that was what Rabbi Shraga Dovid already did, and in Israel they didn't. The only problem with that assertion is that if you go and look, and particularly in the articles, the essays by Ezra Fleischer, you'll find that Rabbi Elazar Kallir, in fact, did write Piyutim, did write a Kedushta for Shabbos Eicha. So the entire Yesod of the distinction between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, which would be very geschmack, because then Sfarad is Hemshech to Bavel, but it seems like Eretz Yisrael had this as well. I, at least as of this moment, have not found any systematic later academic treatment of the question of how it originated, and Eretz Yisrael versus Bavel, Ashkenaz versus Sfarad. Still have a gap in the information there. But it seems like in Sfarad they continued actively with this minhag, and as we saw, their Gedolei Paitanim continued adding to that minhag, whereas in Ashkenaz, as far as what I've seen so far, I haven't seen any reference at all to any such minhag, certainly not any new additions within Ashkenaz. But the point is that it's a very chashuv alta minhag that is as old as the minhag of Piyutim themselves. And so it's interesting how Sfarad was maintaining a perfectly old, legitimate minhag, and how suddenly in the era of Radbaz, all of a sudden they went to war to delete it, to erase it, to destroy it. And of course, Radbaz himself is attesting to the fact that some stopped, but many others still do it, and we see that it was printed in the Seder Arbatinius for many, many generations. What's interesting is that if you look in the Seder Arbatinius from Lavarno, Tafar Shidal, you'll notice that it says in small letters, Tikkun Shabbos, Shabbetai Shabbos, Batamas, Tisha B'av. Aval, ein minhagenu loyma shum kinah begibul Shabbos elu. Ach, ein minim ktsasam b'Tisha B'av b'toich she'ara kinos. So they printed it with the same titles, they copied and pasted everything, but they added, our minhag is not to say it and any of these three Shabboses, but instead it was incorporated into Tisha B'av itself. There's more that could be said on the topic. There's another tshuva from the era of the Radbaz, from Shud Zakan Aaron, I believe, and later sources, like we mentioned, from the Chidah, but we're not going to get into all of that. There is an article in the Torah supplement to Hamavaser Torani, issue number 400, from a couple of years ago, in the V'derashta V'chakarta section, discussing mechkarim, pulmusim, and there's a bit of an overview there on Shabbos Shalimei Ben Amatzarim. You can find some of the basic sources there, but certainly no larger discussion we got into as to where what happened in the era before the Radbaz. The discussion kind of begins from the Radbaz and on, and like I said, that's where you can find more on that. What I'm interested more in at the moment is tracing what happened in the centuries before the Radbaz. He mentions kovtzim Meiri and the Magen Avos. He says the Meiri writes, "V'chein kasav ha'goyim she'afal b'shel Shabbos neser b'kol minei hasped b'kol inyan shel kinah b'Shabbos eicha hitiru l'koyim b'tzibur derech hachano shviras hayetzer mipnei sheyesh b'schilas hachurban etc. Chelek mishar sheyat shova v'chol she'ikri let shova lachno hutru sh'arat tfilos agavon." So he's quoting the Goyim, by which you'd have to check what he means when he says Goyim. Meiri has interesting kinoyim. But there are those who specifically addressed this question. So the Kadmonim addressed the question and they were materit. He says in Shutter Yivash, there's also a reference to a scenario in which they couldn't find someone to be mekaynin b'Shabbos chazayin. So it was clearly a minhag that was accepted b'pshitos and justified, and just interesting to note the turnaround. Moving on to the next inyan, discussing some unique kinahs that were recited specifically by the Sephardim with reference to Gerush Sfarad. So this is an interesting makar. It's in Shut Halachas Ktanas by Rabbi Yaakov Hagiz, which is quite an interesting sefer. I gave a shiur about it that wasn't recorded a couple of months ago. Just the sefer itself and some of the interesting things in the sefer. Yaakov Hagiz is obviously an interesting individual, the father of Moshe Hagiz, an even more interesting individual. So this halachas katanas chelik aleph and chelik beis, and chelik beis siman kuf lamet tes. There is a question: she'ela ma tivan shel eze kinos she'omrin b'tisha b'av. The whole sefer is structured as these short questions and answers. I believe in the Mavai to the Zichron Aron edition, there's an arichas about how, or probably also in the whatever introduction there was to the printed work, about how there was some kind of format in Rabbi Yaakov Hagiz's yeshiva. He helmed a yeshiva in Yerushalayim, which itself is interesting. That's not the topic right now, but there was some format there where towards the end of the week in particular, on Friday, there was some kind of program system in which he would pose questions and the Talmidim would have to answer it, and somehow halachas katanas originated in that context. But without delving too deeply into that, that's the basis of the interesting questions and the interesting answers. The question is, what's the deal with some of the Kinos and Tisha B'av? The thing is with this question, it's not really a good question. It looks like it was dashed off as a way of expressing more like a title as to what this is about. Because it's only a question with reference to specific kinahs, and the question just says Eze kinahs. Well, which ones? So the answer tells us which ones. The answer says, Yesh mehen ru'iyas le'omar mo'edirim b'chiva hasped. Some are worthy to be said and get people crying. Yesh mehen she'ein nochein lo'imran k'goyin hagemul hazeh kivinu. And I'll pause here before I continue. Hagemul hazeh kivinu. So what's this all about? So if you take a look again, let's say the Arbatanias minhag hasfardim. I'm looking at the one from Tafresh Yudal Lavarno. So if you go flip through most of the Kinos for Tisha B'av, I think more towards the end, you'll find Avinu, Hagmul Hazeh Kivinu, Alalai Miha of Gidel Abanim, Lasis Behem Nakama, V'yishpach Aleim Harugim, Bezav Gadol V'chema, Adoma Sham Yeshavnu Gam Bachinu. So it's sort of confronting the Eibishter and saying, is this what we deserved? Is this what we thought we would get? What kind of father does this? And then Hashem responds, Matitziku elai kulchem, tlenisechem bo adai, mitzoris heshati eschem, b'chol yoyim ba'atam eidoi, b'chasti v'lo yishkachtem, shvilai alalai, bonem atarivun elai, yotzu achichem grushem, mi sheretz umi sibilia, Reisi Ke'orpim Koshem, Yevesi Grush Castilia, Vishitzilia, Aragon, Granada, Oilai. So Hashem responds and says, what are you complaining about? I've helped you and you didn't listen, and now the Yidden were expelled. And it's like a dialogue. They didn't respond. And Hashem responds, and again, back and forth. The Yidden say, Hashem responds, back and forth in this vein. So, on the one hand, it's a dialogue, and Hashem gets the last word, and then it concludes, Zocher Tiskar V'Seinu, the Yidden say, remember, Shlach L'Nagul, and Hashem concludes and says, Ani ba'atzim v'chvedi achter keser l'uma. Sure, okay, Hashem says, I will. That's the format of the kinah. Now, first of all, it's interesting to note that right at the beginning there, the first response from Hashem seems exceptionally long. It seems about double long. Also, it's interesting that the second portion of that doubly long passage says, Yotzu achechem grushim, and then Hashem's next passage in response to Yidden is, Hitzesi eschem grushim. So I actually found a work called Al Nahri Sfarad, Kinos and Tisha B'av, Al Churban Yerushalayim, Al HaPur'oniyos Ad Gezeris Kufnun Aleph. So really, it shouldn't be including the later Gerush. Fi Ksav Yad Yochad Ba'olam B'Sifriyah HaMamlachtit B'Lisbon, Orach V'Haisef Mavai Ha'aris Mafteches Shimon Berenstein from 1956. So even though his work is a manuscript that only spans through Gezeris Kufnun Aleph, but in his Mavai, he's discussing the concept of censorship, or even self-censorship, when kinahs referencing historical events were printed, and then there was the concern of how explicit we can get. So he wants to point to a similar phenomenon with the Gerush Taka of 1492. And he describes that there was a work called Imrei Noam that was published in Amsterdam between 1628 and 1630. And it's Shirim, Pizmoinim, Tfilis, and Tchinas, printed by Rabbi Yisrael ben Menashe. And there's a kinah for Tisha B'av from an anonymous author, he says, like a vikuach between Knesset Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is, he says, is typical in the sorrowful songs of Spanish Jewry. And here he sort of formats it very nicely. Knesset Yisrael. Avinu, Agmul Azeh Kivinu, Mia Av Gidol Banim Lasas B'em Nekama, V'yishbach Aleim Charena B'af Gadol V'chemel, Adam Hashem Yeshav Negam B'chinu. Hashem responds, Matitzukun Elai Kolchem, L'nesechem Bo Wadai. And it doesn't have anything about Grushim. That's 4 lines, each is 4 lines, or it begins with 4 lines each, then it's 3 lines each. Knesset Yisrael, Diminu, Shaddai, Chasdecha, Achar Avru Kamashanim. And then Hashem responds, Tzesi Eschem Grushim Eretz Tzvi El Shivya, Isi Orbachem Koshem, Leikshavtim Lishaya V'Yirmiyah. That is Hashem's response. In this version of Imrei Noam, the formatting looks nice. It's 4 lines Yidden, 4 lines Hashem, 3 lines, and in the 4th passage, Hashem says, Tzesi Eschem Grushim, but no specific reference to any particular events. So Berenstein says, 40 years after this kinah was printed in Amsterdam in the 1620s, it was printed in the Seder Arbatinius in Venice and Taf Lamed Aleph in 1671, and here we can see what censorship had occurred. In the 4th passage, instead of Hitzesi Eschem Grushim in Imrei Noam, it says, Yotzu achechem grushim misharetzim mishsevilia, risi korpim koshem, visi grush Castilia, Sicilia, Aragon, Granada, Oilalai, Alalai. So according to Berenstein, Hitzesi Eschem Grushim is the censored version. Yotzu achechem grushim is the uncensored version. It's either way, it's supposed to be the 4th passage. So although he doesn't say it, that means that the way it's printed in the later Seder Arbatinius is censored, both censored and uncensored, and the uncensored version was just sort of inserted after the 2nd passage and made it double as long, and that's clearly not meant to be correct. So I don't know if this has been pointed out. I imagine someone has, but I didn't come across it And Bernstein's comment, where he was just trying to indicate the censorship in the 1620s, was helpful to make a little sense of the text over there, which appears to be a bit mixed up. As for the author of this particular piyut, this particular song, even though Bernstein says it's anonymous in the Sefer Piyutim, because they don't write anyone's name in those. But there's a work called Moreshet Yudei Sfarad v'Hamizrach Mechkarim Barichat Yisachar Ben Ami Yerushalayim Tavshim Beis Magnus. There's a chapter, there's an essay, Shirim Eru'im Historiam B'Shirat Yehudei Morocco by Yosef Shitrit, and his focus, as he says, is specifically on Moroccan Jewry and songs or kinahs referencing historic events. And he has a passage there in which he says that from Gerish Svar in Portugal, there are many kinahs that were composed by Meshirim from among those who were banished, who settled in Morocco and Algeria, which is his focus. And for example, he says, Gam kinato shel mer dividas avinu agmul azeki vinu alai, which is the Meshier complaining about the great punishment, the terrible punishment, and the terrible suffering and incomprehensible suffering of children, babies, women, girls. He says that particular kinah is very, very common in the manuscripts that he is consulting for this research. So at any rate, now we have a name for the author, the one who composed this shiur that was included in standard prints of kinahs for Tisha B'av for Sephardim. So now back to the halachas ktanas. The halachas ktanas says, Yesh man she'inochem la'imron kegoyin hagmul hazeh kivinu nire kekoirei tagar u'chemisraim al midoisav. Like what? You're just going and confronting Hashem and complaining and then suggesting you think something was wrong? You're saying Hagmul hazeh kivinu, is this what you were expecting to receive in return from Hashem? What were you expecting? After we did bad, we didn't behave, so we deserved it. If not for Hashem's kindness, we would have been even worse off. So that's his criticism to him. The premise is completely wrong, completely off. The whole piyut, the whole kinah, the whole shiur should not have been written. Of course, it is a larger, more interesting question, and you could say even till today we find these divisions and approaches to tragedies, and sometimes it ends up being Chabad versus others. Chabad sometimes seems to be more likely to approach Hashem with kindness, and other communities are less likely to do so, although you can't completely generalize in either direction. But there have been controversies in the last few decades, even specifically with regard to Chabad, and attempts within Chabad to grapple with this question, with this topic, and what our precise shita and hashkafa is, and to analyze the Rebbe's reactions in different scenarios. But it's just interesting that this Meir Dividas thought it was appropriate, and I believe it was Bernstein who said that this is very common, a very common theme in Spanish song. And of course, it's giving voice to both sides. It's the dialogue. It's not just one-sided, not just coming with kindness to the Eibishter. Hashem gets to respond. And if anything, that's giving voice to what people are unconsciously thinking. Many people are unconsciously thinking, and giving Hashem's response. To Yaakov Hagiz, this is completely beyond the pale. Why would you even express the thought that we deserved any other outcome, and we should only be grateful that it wasn't worse? It's interesting. But he's not finished. He goes on and he says, Gam oisa shel aleichem ir hakodesh eshel mikem she'elois oisam she'elois yesh l'shalom utinoikus kamoy beleil Pesach. Okay, so what is this about? So sure enough, in those kovtzim kinos of Sfarad, there is another kinah, and the kinah goes like this: Aleichem eda kedosha, eshal mikem she'elois, ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylos, madua beleil Pesach oichlem matzos u'meroirim, ata halayla hazeh savanu buz u'meroirim, al herek aksherim al zera yesharim, al kein b'vchi tamrurim, Esa koilu b'choilis, ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylas. Madua b'leil Pesach shulchan aruch b'simcha, ata b'veinisenu b'leil zeh kol hanacha, aha kiloi motzonu lekaf ragleinu menucha, oy ki bo atzara al kein eshkach mechoilis, ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylas. Madua b'leil Pesach shesim kaisis b'vracha, ata anachnu b'leil zeh nikra megillas eicha b'golos yeshavti uvasi eretz mevucha, Lachen ani al kacha a kol yalalas ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylas. And a few more passages in this vein. Madua b'leil Pesach kain and tamid hagada, ata neimer b'leil zeh b'chi tamid rukvada. Madua b'leil Pesach nigmor tamid hahalal, ata anachnu b'leil zeh nehi misped v'leil. Madua b'leil Pesach imim shveich b'zimra, ata b'leil zeh shasinu la reishu mara. And then the last passage is esnachmu b'golas bonim yeshrim b'tzion, and so on in that vein. So also interesting structure. It's just creating a contrast between Leil Pesach and this night, and the joy of Leil Pesach and the sadness of this night. It's capturing that line, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylas, which is more positive and joyous on Pesach and can be repurposed and used in a more negative sense. Why is this night different? Why is this night so bad? It sounds later, perhaps sounds later. The voice, the narrator sounds perhaps a few more centuries after the Kinos that we're used to. But again, just looking at the kinah itself, seems reasonable, seems decent, doesn't seem completely out of line. And yet, Yaakov Hagiz is calling it out, is declaring it out of line. Before we get back to what he writes in Halachas Ktanis, it's just interesting to note in this context that this piyut gets mentioned in a surprising place. Perhaps you wouldn't expect to find it there. But in the Sefer Noyek Hatzoin Yosef, the Psakim minhagim of Kilas Ashkenaz, and particularly Frankfurt, by Rabbi Yosef Segal, printed in Hanoi in Tafayin Ches, reprinted recently. So, in Hilchas Leil Rishon Shel Pesach with Kairich, he writes, "V'tam lazeh she'emer Kinos ahil b'zman shebeis hamikdash kayim." So he says, "The pasuk al matzos u'meroirim nirmaz the Tisha B'av chol ba'isa yoyim shechol Rishon Shel Pesach." Matzos u'meroirim, matzos is positive, joyful. Meroirim is negative, mournful. The pasuk itself is being meramez that Tisha B'av is connected to Pesach. They always. If you know the day of Pesach, you know the day of Tisha B'av. It's the same day of the week. Al Pia Siman At Bash V'chul, the famous Siman At. So the Aleph, the first day of Pesach, is Tav. The same day as Tisha B'av. Bash, the second day of Pesach, is Shin, the same day as Shavuos. And in the new Machon Shlomo Omen edition, the Metzayin, that this goes back to the Avudraham. And then in parentheses, the Noyek Hatzoin Yosef adds, "Ulezeh mekoinen em asfardim b'leil Tisha B'av sheshoylen ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylas v'chulu halayla hazeh kulei morer." So to add to his vart that it's connected, he cites the Sephardim taka. The Sephardim ask ma nishtana halayla hazeh kulei morer on Tisha B'av, and in the footnote they're Metzayin to Aleichem Eda Kedosha Yashal Mikem She'elois ma nishtana. And then he goes on to say, I'll Pesach at Tisha B'av. So he goes on to say a word about Kinos Ahil. To the question of authorship, I was not able to find anyone who addresses who the author might be. Bernstein actually includes that one in his Al-Nar Sfarad. Presumably it relates to an earlier tzara, not the Gerish Sfarad. His work only contains up to Gzeres Kufnan Aleph. He has some ma'aras on aspects of it, commenting on the minhag and even the particular melody with which the Sephardim who recited it would recite it, but nothing on who the author might be. So apparently, at least in the Kisvei Yad that he saw, there was no authorship. So back to the halachas ktanas. Gam oisa shel aleichem etc. Oisam she'elas yesh l'shalom l'tinoikas kamoy b'leil Pesach v'loy l'fnei kahal v'adas kodesh. So he's insulting. Yeah, ma Nishtana, that's for the children. Taka, that's to him a negative. It's dismissive. It's not appropriate to say it in shul. Shekadei lahatim ma Nishtana halayla zeh mikol halaylas sider dvarim tfeilim mibli tam. You wanted to say ma Nishtana, you thought that was a nice refrain, but your actual questions are ridiculous. Very literal reading perhaps of the period. Like, why? What's your question? Because we do this on Pesach, so you have a kasha on Tisha B'av. He seems to be saying that, our Pesach isn't that great either. Our Pesach is also very gallistic. So we do on Pesach what we need to do on Pesach. We do on Tisha B'av what we need to do on Tisha B'av. We're in gallis for both of them. I don't know what you're asking. So that's his approach he takes to reading piyutim. And then he adds, but to show that we rejoice with mitzvahs, we do achanas that are remes to the gula, and I think he's referring here to Tisha B'av. The sprach here, b'chalal, is a bit difficult to follow. I don't know what the reason for that is, but he seems to be referring to the Sephardic minhagim, that they would do things on Tisha B'av that were remes to the gula. So that's to indicate that even on Tisha B'av we have a certain simcha. We're doing what the Eibishter told us to do, and we're getting ready for the gula. But otherwise, we're in galus equally for both. The simcha of Tisha B'av later will be greater than Pesach. I don't know if he means Pesach now or Pesach then, but there's no kasha. Right now, it's sad, and Los Lavi, it's going to be Freilach, and no kashas. Then towards the end, he circles back to the first one, Hagmul Hazeh. So he says, if you think it's such a geshmaka thing and you don't want to just delete it, you want to fix it, so we would have to restructure the whole thing. You have to say it fakert. B'ni, Hagmul Hazeh kivisi, al Hashem tigmul uzois. Put the question in Hashem's mouth. Hashem turns to Yidden and says, is this how I should be treated? What's wrong with you, Yidden? How did you behave like this? And then the Yidden have to answer and fan for sich, Manasa, Shisar Shabbos Isamakev, Goyim Shinishru Beinenu, Hema Hamamunu, V'roiv Tova Shnasatali, Oili Ki Marisi, Kivamokim Shali Lahachs of Teva Kosh Baruch Hu, Nafachti V'chulu, V'chein Al Zadarech. So you would have to flip the whole thing around if you like that format, if you like the dialogue. That's his take. Very harsh take on those piyutim. I think many would read those piyutim and think they don't necessarily stand out and are deserving of such scorn. And maybe there's different tastes in piyutim, but that's just, he was a very hush of a Rav and Pesach, and that was his take on these piyutim, these kinahs, which is very interesting. Of course, as we saw with the Kinos for Shabbos, they were still printed and reproduced in the kovtzim of Sephardic kinahs, but you do find a number of other Sfarim as well, mentioning that the minhag is not to say them, a hin, a hair, back and forth. So he's many generations after the Radbaz, but his irur also kicked in a bit and also caused conflict as to whether these should be recited or not. Now, interestingly, as is common in halachas ktanis, there are his sophists from Moshe Hagiz, who calls himself Haminiach, Rashi Tevis. So here too, there are a number of passages relating to Tisha B'av, and then towards the end, he writes, L'tivon shalakinas re'isi ani haminiach shenasiyastu al pi akdama zu, that they could be better understood if you have this idea in mind. And he says, you do them first, and that of course, anyone who has a tzara, it's hurtful, it's painful, it's upsetting. But someone who is a sos v'sameach shoket v'shanam nipachadura, someone who was at the opposite extreme, who was completely confident, he wasn't expecting it, and then a tzara strikes him, even if it's a very small tzara, it hurts a lot more. And kol shekein if it's taka tzara g'dayla v'ra. Why? Because he says the opposite, extreme opposites, if you bring them together, they clash. So Kocha Anachnu B'nei Yisrael, that we were Berum HaMailas, we were at the top of the world. Adi Yisenu Kelikim, Yerdi Toivara, V'ata B'vei Yisenu Yoradnu L'Tachtiyah Yisbe'umka D'Tohem Araba. How far we've come, how high we were, how low we've fallen. So with this Hakdama, so since on Tisha B'av you're trying to feel the tsar, the goal is to feel the tsar, to maximize the tsar, so you remind yourself of good memories, and that just makes you feel worse, and that's the point. And he adds, perhaps that's taka the pshat and the eish tukat bekirbi, but tzeisaynu mitzrayim, tzeisaynu mirushalayim. Dafka drawing that contrast makes you feel worse. Because what's your point? Your point is, look how great it was when we left Mitzrayim, and then look how terrible it was when we left Yerushalayim. Now I feel even worse about how it looked when we left Yerushalayim. So that's a defense for the Kinos and Tisha that mentioned the Mailas Habonim al Shulchan Aviyim, and then the Galus Ta'atzara Hi Bekaflayim. So interestingly, he pushes back a bit and defends seemingly the first one, Hakmol Zekivinu, because he says it's not really questioning Hashem. His defense is that it's just intended to make you feel even more horrible about what actually happened. And then to go even further, take his point even further, he says, I think if someone sat down and read Shir HaShirim instead, and you read it with the right kavana, and you really paid attention to the words, to the meaning, you'll cry even more than when you read Sefer Kinos, when you read Sefer Eicha. Because you see the great, beautiful connection you didn't have with the Eibishter. And now look where we are right now, Babei Niseinu. So Yigdal Abchiva Mispid B'Yoser. So the more positive you go, the more saddening and more hurt one feels. So that's an interesting back and forth taka on later Sephardic Kinos taking place between father and son in the late 1600s, you could say. The Sefer, I believe, was printed first in Taf Samech Daled, so that's right at the beginning of the 1700s, but Yaakov Hagiz himself passed away in 1674, so this discussion, this debate is taking place, one would say, broadly in the latter half of the 1600s. One might also draw parallels to much later discussions in the Ashkenazi world, particularly after the Holocaust, about the idea generally of introducing new kinahs and the impulse, the instinct of many Gedolim, or perhaps you could say most Gedolim, not to include new kinahs, and to not view kinahs as just a platform for us to just express our feelings, any old feelings about any old incident. And kinahs are seen, piyutim in general, are seen as very hallowed and sanctified, and they have to be written by kadmonim. And I think we're getting a bit of that tone from Rabbi Yaakov Hagiz as well, in the sense of he's showing this respect because he doesn't take the authors seriously, and he sees them almost as contemporaries. And what are you saying? What are these feelings you're expressing, and who are you? And we'll leave that topic there for now. And finally, throwing Bedalach on Tisha B'av. There are other names and nicknames as well, but the one that seems to be the most common is Bedalach. Now, growing up, obviously I'm more familiar with Chabad than other communities, although depending on the topic, I'm somewhat familiar with other places as well. But Bedalach, the idea that there's this mischief, you're throwing these balls, these perhaps sticky or spiky balls at people on Tisha B'av, is a concept you grew up hearing about in Chabad. There's perhaps a reference to it in Sefer HaMinhagim. If you look in Sefer HaMinhagim for Tisha B'av, there's an unusual passage out of character with the general tone of Sefer HaMinhagim. I believe it's copied from the Rebbe's Shemus. And it says there that Samech Tzedek fleckt rufen, dem Originate, der Heilige Originate, Vesiper, der Heilige Originate, Merachike ven Atzvus, Afilu Meridas, is Bachsidim geworden, Stifferei. The Originate was negating Atzvus, or even Meridas, including on Tisha B'av, and that translated for the Chassidim into mischief. Tisha B'av hat man sich gespielt in Bedalach, and then it goes on, the more famous story about how they accidentally caught the Originate in a trap, and the Originate said, Ribono shel Olam, deine Kinder halten nicht an Yom Tov, to nehmen zu von sie. If your children don't keep your Yom Tov properly, they're acting silly on Tisha B'av, so take it away. So on the one hand, it is referring to the Originate. On the other hand, it's mentioned in Sefer Minhag Chabad. And growing up, there was this notion that there's a Meiser Shmuel Munkes and Yerushalayim of Kallir, that Shmuel Munkes threw something at Yerushalayim of Kallir, who visited on Tisha B'av. Yerushalayim of Kallir was upset, was makpid. Later, Shmuel Munkes was seen being misabel for real, and it gets at this tension that Chassidus had with Atzvus and Meridas, and how Chassidus gets very on edge when there's any issue of Atzvus and Meridas. And so that's why Tisha B'av is a very complex, complicated Yom Tov, and we're still trying to figure out the right balance between being somber and serious versus not getting too carried away. We spend a lot of time making fun of other people who do it the wrong way. Not sure if we've figured out exactly what we are doing and how to do it correctly. So that's a larger issue, a larger topic, so sociological, ideological, and all that. But in addition to that story of Shmuel Munkes and this reference here in Sefer Minhagim, there's this general sense that maybe in the Chabad boys' camps, the children fool around and throw stuff. When I was in Eretz Yisrael, I actually, last time I was there was many years ago. I was a young boy, but I still remember we spent Tisha B'av in Yerushalayim. We went to the Chabad Minyan in Sanhedria, and sure enough, the children were actively throwing. It wasn't the old betelach from the shtetl, was something else, but some small bit that grows on a tree. They were throwing it mamish throughout Eicha and Kinos and making a whole scene, and the elders were screaming at them. It's a garnish golfen, a whole scene. So, growing up, you don't think about it too much. You assume, I guess it's mainly a Chabad thing. So it's interesting to observe that it's actually not only not a Chabad thing, but in essence, it's not even really a Hasidic thing. And in fact, it goes back many hundreds of years and precedes the era of Chassidim altogether. And someone mentioned that it's somewhat reminiscent of Nittel, in that sense, that Nittel today is considered a Chassidic minhag, and really it's the Chassidim are preserving an older minhag that has otherwise been forgotten in other communities, perhaps because other communities didn't think it was relevant anymore. Conditions changed, situations changed, and the Chassidim preserve it. I just saw an interesting piece in a Yiddish children's magazine about how Skver has a minhag that the baby doesn't go into the crib for the first 30 days, and they make some kind of makeshift shelf on a chair. They put the child in that, and the article was emphasizing that it's not a Skver minhag, it's an old Ashkenazi minhag that goes back many hundreds of years, and Skver are the only ones who are preserving it. So it's an interesting phenomenon to note when this happens and how something comes to be identified with the particular group that's still being Mekayim the minhag when they're really preserving an Ur Alta minhag. So, came across Divrei Yisrael Welcz of Budapest. He passed away in Tafshin Lamed Daled, and then in Tafshin Mem, his Einikel printed his Tshuvas from his Ksav Yad. So in Chelik Aleph Eir Chaim, in Siman Kufnin Hey, we find that he writes as follows: Nasatya libi lalamit schus ma sheyesh latmoya in Yiddish Kehilas Kishiyosh Malaritz Tisha B'av V'Koden Akinis HaMinhag Shatinoikis Eisen Rash HaYadesh Zerkin Zelazek kovtzim. They're throwing these thorny, spiky things at each other, and they make a tumult. And I've seen adults do it. And no one is moicha. It's not only a disgrace to Tisha B'av, it's a disgrace to the shul. And it's not something new from the last 100 years. Ayin be'El Yerabah in Siman Tov Kufin Tes writes, the Kol Shekain Shira Alai HaMaisa B'Mesh HaMiktzas Noig and Kalus V'Zerkin Zelazeh Beis HaKnesses. The El Yerabah already said it. And before him, I'm a Kitzah Shalah Shekosav V'Ra Alai HaMaisa Hanasab Yishuv Mekforim B'Tisha B'av Beis HaKnesses HaChutzbis V'Akalas Roish V'Chol HaMar B'Lasis Chutzbis Hareze Meshubach Zerkin Zelazeh V'Ein Echad Moicha B'Yadam V'Chlu Ayin Sham. So the El Yerabah, the Kitzah Shalah, they're being Moicha. Well, he differentiates, he distinguishes. He says, there, Kaid and Tagar ala Dover. Komakim, Lahaya Misha Moiche B'Dover Kaniska. Lamaisa, no one was being Moiche. So he describes that, he summarizes that as a state in which there was no Macha. It is Mitzayin to Sefer Oil Avram, Drush to Shabbos Nachmu, who also mentioned it, also negatively, very harsh, very sharp. And he adds for Leirah, Divrei El Yerabah V'Shalah Zal. It's really Kitzah Shalah. And then Bishral Welcz makes an interesting analogy to clapping Haman on Purim, with the implication being that it also originated as mere silliness around the shul. And you see that many communities didn't do it, certain communities did. The Ramah says, Siman Tavish Tzaddik, Oid kos v'shinogu atinoikis l'tzur tzuras hamana itzim va'avonim or lichtav shim hamana leim ula kaisen zelzeh kadei shim achashmoi umizeh nishtar biv haminhag shemakim haman k'shekeirim hamagil v'beis HaKnesses. So it started off as a children's thing, that itself was a children's thing, to put Haman on stuff and to hit it and erase it. And from there, Nishtana of a minhag that they're clapping Haman and Shul, which he doesn't state it clearly, but presumably it's also a bit silly. So you have already Kadmoinim mentioning it, but the whole explanation, the whole evolution is the children did this, the people in the shul did that, and now let's take it seriously. Let's not express ourselves in a mocking way towards it. Dr. Welcz, from the Ramos tone, he's explaining Shemizen Ishtar Biv HaMinhag Mavur Melashayne Dirak Ishtar Biv, he writes. It came to be, however it came to be, and he's saying not to make fun of it, not to mock it, but is it really a serious thing? Which is interesting, because at this point, the Welcz kind of looks at it as the Heilige Minhag. But Welcz says if you look at the early sources, it's kind of a funny thing, it's kind of a silly thing, and then at some point we decided to take it seriously. So there's a bit of an analogy there. He quotes the Machzik Bracha, also she'ein latmoya amad b'chol tfutzis Yisrael oisem rash u'pirsam gadol u'makim lahaman v'chayetze v'tibaka ha'aretz l'koilam, and giving different tirutzim and hasbeirim as to why it's the right thing to do, and he's mitzayin to others. So you see how Gedolim are raising an eyebrow, but also defending it. So in a sense, there's an analogy here, but on the other hand, in lahavi raya, because Tisha B'av shechayavim l'kainin al golos hashchina v'churban abayis me'echet eisei ma'ro al kachal l'simcha ma'azuesa on Purim chach, it's Purim. There's a little bit more, a little room for silliness. We can take this silliness seriously, but how does that vibe fit in on Tisha B'av? Then he's been saying that in Shut Maram Shiktak, he writes that Maril lo yav kimli begavei, Maril couldn't decide if this minhag to clap in Haman is kosher v'yosher kol kach, or sheyotz schore be'afseidoi. But since the Ramah cited it, so we're not going to mevatel it. I assume that's Maram Shik talking. Obviously, the sequence is Maril, Ramah, and then much later Maram Shik. Some Kain, Dr. Welcz, it follows that Tisha B'av Kapanim Yish Levatel HaMinhag Mikol V'Kol. But we started off saying Nasati Alibri Lilam Tzchos. So now he says V'Liya Hedjit Yesh Ponim Hanirin Lahamtzi Tam Gam Al HaMinhag Hazeh Yan Kol Minhag Yisrael Teirehi Afilu minhag garua noivei amimakar tahar. Afilu minhag sheish bekabbalah b'yad neshei Yisrael. As Kinos and Lister, mitzayin to the Rajra, mitzayin to the Chasam Sofer, she'ein lifshit yad minhag Yisrael, even minhag burrs, you think, the ones you consider to be minhag burrs are not burrs, they're be'eros, chatzuvim, mayim chayim. Of course, the Chasam Sofer is coming within a particular context of defending minhagim in the face of reform, but still, that creates a drive to rationalize and defend even questionable minhagim. Of course, everyone draws the line somewhere, and there are certain behaviors that many would say that, look, just because many people are doing X, Y, and Z doesn't make it a minhag. But happens to be in this case, Welcz is correctly pointing out that this has been going on for centuries, and it's fascinating. Clapping Haman is mischief in Shul, and that got sanctified and hallowed, and they're also clapping in Shul on Tisha B'av, and it's been going on for hundreds of years across Europe. What's going on? So he quotes Achsidah Shavart, and the makar for the Achsidah Shavart, interestingly, is the Yatav Panim. The vart is Ki kol ha-mitzvahs tzrichen lasas b'simcha. Everything has to be b'simcha, and even when you're makayrin al golos hashchina has to be b'simcha, that you're being zeicha to be magish tzar hashchina kaviyachol. So he teaches to the pasuk kubi reini balayla l'reish hashmuras shifchi kamayim libech nechri p'nei Hashem. But heißt kumi reini. Is it kumi reini or is it shifchi kamayim libech? Which one is it? But because it's noichach p'nei Hashem, so it's kumi reini for an simcha freilichkeit. So with that Yisoid, Dr. Welcz, he wants to say that Yesh Leima, that B'Shanim Kadmonius, there were B'nai Aliyah. They would sit on Tisha B'av on the earth, and they would say kinah, and they would cry, and they would feel the Golos HaShechina, Kemat ad Kleis HaNefesh, like they say about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi Zal, tying in different topics here in our wide-ranging discussion. They were mamish. They got the weepy part right. But you also have to feel the simcha. So that's why some anger fear to throw stuff at each other. That's going to prevent them from reaching full-fledged, full-on atzvos. So we shouldn't be mevatel it because a mole, it had significance. So this is very, very interesting. So the whole path that he takes, the question, the answer, the teretz essentially is a chassidish teretz, and l'chayret that's taka the emes as to why it seems like the chassidish olam in particular ran with it, and definitely are indications that this was taka the chassidish hashkafa. Pashtus, it doesn't really explain historically how it started, and the way it started seems like it was more of just a childish thing, and the adults partaking in it originally, way back with the Kitzur Shalah, were probably not the Bnei Aliyah. But once the Chassidim arrived on the scene, then from the Chassidus perspective, their Taka were Bnei Aliyah doing this as well. And the Bnei Aliyah Taka had the Azam and Cheshbon, more or less. Was it that you have to feel the simcha while you're feeling the tsar, or was it simply to avoid the atzvos, to make sure mafal Nishtana atzvos, because that's a big concern? But something along those lines, Taka was the chassidish reason for embracing it. Interestingly, he seems to acknowledge, though, that l'chayah not really negaya now, and he's just saying it started off with a good tatam, so that's enough of a reason to continue doing it. There are others that discuss this in recent dairas, and they may also present a partial defense, and then they'll say, but today it's certainly not negaya, and halavai, people should have a little tsar. Interesting, Welcz doesn't add that caveat. Welcz says the minhag is the minhag, and the minhag has a good reason, so the minhag bleibt the minhag. Now, in addition to the Divrei Yisrael, there are other Mekayros as well. You can find a number of these Mekayros once again in one of these Torah supplements, this time Mishpacha's supplement Kolmas, number 15. There's an article under the title Minhag Tisha B'av, Badalach Babkis, Lizrok Olo. And the Malak in a number of the Mekayros, neutral or negative, Zechreinis, etc. I'll just point to some additional Mekayros in discussion. There's a book that came out, Sefer that came out in the last couple of years, Shari Nechama. He quotes the Mishnah Brura. The Mishnah Brura also mentions this. It's mamash an often a Mishnah Brura. I believe he's copying the text from the Eliyah Rabbah. But alay ha'maisa b'meshach tzas negin kalas v'zerkin zelazeh b'beis ha'knesses kol mini dvarim ktanim v'avin gadlu dafil shlei b'tisha b'av asal hadas kalas b'beis ha'knesses kol shkin b'tisha b'av b'shas kinos she'am Yisrael mekaydinim al beis Hashem shenechrev al amish nivzuru b'chol ha'olam. So the Mishnah Brura is also one of those saying Musar. And I may have seen in the past Taka this quote from the Mishnah Brura, but maybe I assumed that the Mishnah Brura is Taka criticizing the Chassidim. But it's, as we saw, it's not quite like that. It actually goes further back. Interestingly, the Shari Nechama quotes that Moshe Schwab, who was a Yekish Litvish Talmud, who was a Mashkiach Ruchni and Gate said, Moshe Schwab offered a defense. Moshe Schwab also said, and maybe less Chassidish Oisius, but B'Shanam Kadmonius, there were those that were very misable on the Churban, they took it to heart, and there was a chash that they would lose their mind from Tsar, so that's why they began this minhag, just to be Messiach a little das from the Avelos. But the person writing this is Omram, today there's no such chash, so certainly not to throw anything, and it's just Kalas Reish, and you have to makabel the Musar of the Mishnah Brura. So it's interesting, though, that Ramesh Schwab was also defending it, perhaps because in his childhood it was still common even in Germany, because, as we said, it really was a widespread, pervasive minhag, and it really had nothing to do with Chassidim per se. Another interesting makar that I didn't see referenced in too many places, I saw someone quotes from Rav Sroya Dublitsky, who was Metzayin to Rabbi Yaakov Emden. What does Rabbi Yaakov Emden say? The person quoting this also quotes Rabbi Yaakov Emden in his Siddur, in the Shar HaDalek Tisha B'av, Delas Beis, Chalim Beis. So Dr. Yaakov Emden also the saper sicha kala b'shas aminas akinas v'lo letzei sachutza. It's not the time for chit chat, not the time to step outside for a break, which are lower level offenses that people might do when they get bored. And he writes in parentheses, unless you need the bathroom, then I'll let you step outside. Classic. Why? Don't exclude yourself from the Avelos. And Yaakov says, and I'm not even going to talk about I'm not even going to bother to write ledaber mekali oilam hasmechim le'ed hagruim ibnei nechar, worse than goyim shafilu eveinu Hashem b'meisonu misablim u'boichim. Even our enemies who hear us cry libam nishbar v'netz, even they feel bad. The halalu, and these people are worse. L'schoi gaisam lehem she'arim gulroyin haktanim isgarim. Essentially, they turn it into a sport. Habanim malaktim eitzim v'ha'avis mevarim v'agdolim kasumim v'cheivrim moishchem yideyim asloititzim maligim u'malivim matatim b'techoches olitov moisam echayeyim atu b'rishi u'begavri ketili askinon v'loi nechrev abeiter ela al shalei hisablo al Yushalayim karoi afal pisha hayu b'chsidim gedolim atanoim arishonim. So very, very, very harsh. The shyness tov moisam echayeyim, the Yaakov Emden says. So just an extra marker for Yaakov Emden, again, very clearly nothing to do with Hasidim, and it's much, much earlier than that. A number of Metzayin also to the Sefer Yosef Oimetz, another early Sefer of minhag in Frankfurt from Yosef Yosef Han Norlingen, the Reish of the Yom in Frankfurt, printed the first time in Taf Pei Gimel, also reprinted by Machon Shlomo Omen. And he writes, "Alkein roy lavara minhag Rabbi Kebeinu oisman adam u'masharsim shezorkim u'makin echel lachaveroi u'mesamchim b'tisha b'av kilu hu yamtiv b'beis hakneses shalom b'shas kinos." And we have to give knossos and malchus to those poishim begufam, and not to give anyone a break. Al yi and nesiyas panim b'davar zeh. So a very, very fascinating phenomenon that, in essence, this was extremely widespread among the youth, even among a portion of the adults. And I would suggest that the psychological, the sociological reason is simply that, and I think you see this with children generally, that children don't really go for overly serious and somber moments, and often they're the first ones that sort of break the ice and start giggling and laughing. And somehow the sadness of Tisha B'av just triggered that backlash, and people would feel like the sadness was getting to them. My guess would be, like I said, that it originated not out ideological, but sort of reflexive. It's just a reflexive response by some to the environment. And then at some point, I would assume it was transmitted. It certainly entered the culture and then sort of transmitted itself from generation to generation, place to place, until it was baked into society, baked into the culture, the way we clap Haman on Purim, like Welcz makes the analogy. Yesh Leimar, that in essence, that's not that different. It's the non-ideological cousin of the ideological reason. The ideological reason is given as they saw that people are getting so sad, that's taka gute Zach, it's kedai to lighten the mood a bit, either Rav Schwab's version of it, save them from losing their minds, or Rav Welcz's version that you have to remember simcha, not just atzvos. But the non-ideological version of that is that that's just people's instinct, that when they see that people are going too far. So even before Chassidim arrived on the scene, or any of that, Chassidim were just identifying and pinpointing a problem, a phenomenon that people had instinctively been noticing before. That often the sadness, the vibe, just seemed too depressive, and people felt that it's crossing a line. There's a mood here that needs to be lightened. Obviously, there are many Rabbanim and Gedolim that didn't feel that way at all. Of course, it also depends on how far people got carried away. And again, lav dafka people doing it had any special kavanas, and those who were being meicha, I assume were being meicha because taka seemed tasteless and overdone, and mele if it's for a minute, mashenkin if it's non-stop. But the way I would see it is that there's more instinctual reason that existed all along, that the Chassidim then dwelled on and focused on and developed into more of an ideology, but it's all along the spectrum of feeling a little weirded out when the vibe gets too depressive. It's interesting to note, with regard to more recent history, that in addition to all those halachic sources and Welcz and all that, and there's also a lot of Zechronist literature from the late 1800s, early 1900s, people describing life in the shtetl, and it gets mentioned a lot in that context as well. I happened to come across myself one of the Yisker books for some shtetl. Some woman writes half a page of Zechronist. And what's her zikaron? Her zikaron is she remembers Leil Tisha B'av, the little children scattered throughout the day down the hills to load up with these kovtzim in order to be mekayim that very evening, mitzvahs, mochemes, Shabbetai Tisha B'av. And in her shtetl, at that time, it was the boys against the girls, and the girls would put kerchiefs over their head because the berelach are prickly and sticky and they get stuck in the hair. We know from other stories that it would get stuck in people's beards. So the girls are particularly at risk with being exposed with all their hair. So they'd wear the kerchiefs, and then it would turn into a battle scene. So those are her whimsical memories. So there's a blog, Ama Sefer, touches on bibliographical stuff, interesting curiosities and svarim, books. So on the blog in 2020, there's a post, Shabbetai Tisha B'av, that same term, and the person writing says that one day before Tisha B'av, the library, wherever this is being written from, the person came across this thin booklet, Shemot Simchei Eretz Yisrael, printed in Tafresh Ayin Zayin in 1917, a list of plants that grow in Eretz Yisrael. And the pamphlet, as it happens, is also on HebrewBooks.org. The last page, the person writing says, I noticed an entry, Shabbetai Tisha B'av. That's the name that the person gave it. There's a plant known as Shabbetai Tisha B'av, and he gives the scientific term, Xanthium spinosum. By the way, if you look up xanthium, so xanthium, otherwise known as the cocklebur, is a particular plant. Wikipedia says the leaves are spirally arranged with deeply toothed margins. Some species, notably Xanthium spinosum, are also very thorny with long, slender spines at the leaf bases. And then there's a separate entry for Xanthium spinosum, describing it in great detail and how it's known as the cocklebur, the Bathurst burr, different names, different nicknames. So the point is that this author, in wrote the scientific name, and what's the Hebrew name? Shabbetai Tisha B'av, that's the name. So the person writing this says, this reminded me of a ma'isa from my childhood in the shtibel of Radzin Chassidim in Haifa. The boys in the shtibel, Erev Tisha B'av, would gather what we called golgalach, and we'd bring entire sacks of them to shul. And during Eicha, we'd throw them on the mispalim, and we'd try to aim for their hat or their shirt, and very often it would end with them screaming at us or throwing water at us and kicking us out of the shtibel. And I myself have no idea what the strange minhag, where this minhag came from. We were all so into it as children. I'm sure it was an old minhag, and it was brought to the shtibel from the Chassidish shtibelach back in Europe. And looking into it now, I found Zechronis have been seeing gold, and he describes this minhag in Tisha B'av Adam, where he grew up. Then he found the Eliyah Rabbah, and then he found the Mishnah Brura. But then the blog post has a follow-up, Tosefes. And he says, I got an unbelievable number of responses that essentially made it clear that this was completely widespread across many shows in Eretz Yisrael back in the olden days. And it's also been completely erased, deleted, within the span of one generation, and today it's completely bizarre. No one would believe if they didn't read about it or hear about it. They would never believe that this was such a minhag existed. Obviously, he's coming from a non-Chabad perspective where the memory isn't otherwise preserved, so you have to know of it as a curiosity. And he copies and pastes 12 messages that he received from different people, and each one writes, yeah, when I grew up, yeah, in our shul, in this place, yes, in Eretz Yisrael, yeah, this is what we did, we had this minhag, mamish from across the spectrum. And the discussion about this continues in the comments. I actually saw a different thread elsewhere in a different forum where people were discussing this as well, and someone made the claim that the trees in which these babkalach or bunkalach, different nicknames, grew were particularly fragile, and children climbing up in the trees before Tisha B'av to collect these were getting injured, and someone up high someone high in the authorities made the decision that they're going to just simply chop them down, mow them down, and overnight they eliminated the tree, eliminated the plant, and that is why the minhag disappeared with the speed that it did, which is an interesting claim. Who knows? But essentially, like Welcz said, parallel to Purim shtick in Shul, there was Tisha B'av shtick, extremely widespread, pervasive across Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, across the centuries, in Eretz Yisrael, across all the shuls, as recently as 50, 60 years ago perhaps. And at this point in time, it seems, as far as anyone can tell, it seems to have been completely obliterated from Kemat Gans Kallir Yisrael, as all those Rabbanim who were Meicha over the centuries wanted. And the memory is still preserved faintly, as far as I know, in certain Chabad Kehillas. Like I said, I haven't seen it in Chabad shuls in Crown Heights, but maybe in Chabad camps upstate, and apparently perhaps in Chabad shuls in Eretz Yisrael, there still is some ongoing hemshech continuity to the minhag, which some did defend either in Chassidus Sha'isius or in Balabata Sha'isius, but just a very, very fascinating aspect and dimension to Tisha B'av that's mentioned in the Mishnah Brura, mentioned in the Sfarim, obviously mostly negatively, but very, very fascinating indeed. In conclusion, it's interesting to note the attitude to Kinos and Chabad in general. Like I mentioned, the Rebbe with the Goldschmidt Kinos, which is interesting. Hayam Yoim mentions that the Rebbe Rashab said all of the Kinos, which itself is also interesting, especially in view of his attitude towards piyutim, and even it seems most slichos. It seems perhaps the only piyutim that the Rebbe Rashab said were slichos and el, and Kinos and Tisha B'av. Might literally just be those two things, and not Yom Nirayim, not other tzaimis. Very interesting topic. It's also interesting to know that there's a mimer of the Alter Rebbe, and in one of the gersois of the mimer, it seems like only one of them and not the other. It's a mimer that Alter Rebbe is saying, Ela Maseh biyad Moshe va'Aaron, sha'koil hu ayidei Moshe va'Aaron. K'dechsiv nechisa kaser namecha biyad Moshe va'Aaron. And then it adds a line, Kanizker bekenes Moshe yar'enu va'Aaron yantchanu. That's taka the same B'tzeisim Mitzrayim, B'tzeisim Yerushalayim. So B'tzeisim Mitzrayim Moshe yar'enu va'Aaron yantchanu. Mashen came and says in Yerushalayim, but that hanoch of the Maimer Taka, the Alter Rebbe apparently cited that line and said, Pirush, what's the taich? Taka Moshe is this and Aaron is that. And in conclusion, like we concluded on a previous occasion, like the Rebbe always says, Yehafchi Yom Elu L'moyedim Sasin L'simcha. But until then, I hope and believe we've covered a lot of relatively unknown, fascinating dimensions that relate to the recital of Kinos on Tisha B'av, different minhagim, different days, different shittas. And as Avram Fried sings in a different song, so as Taka Zayin, a Freilich in Tisha